The examiner slid the paper across the table, and I felt the entire room lean in to watch me drown. It was a graduation examination from the University of Paris, advanced analysis, the kind of thing that made grown men in powdered wigs sweat straight through their silk. And they had handed it to me because I was 13 years old, and 13-year-old princes are supposed to be adorable and useless, and I had recently, inconveniently, stopped being either. Let me back up exactly one sentence, because that's the only backing up I'm going to do. 2 weeks earlier, I had been a graduate student in the 21st century, doing maintenance on a wind turbine, when I made intimate contact with the ground from a height that the human body has strong opinions about. The universe's response to this was not death. The universe's response was to file me into the body of Jean-Henri, Crown Prince of France, age 13, in the winter of 1787. Which sounds like a promotion. It is not a promotion. Because I happen to know what comes next for this family. And next is a large public square, a very sharp piece of angled metal, and a crowd that brings snacks. The French Revolution was about a year out. My adoptive father, my adoptive mother, and eventually this exact neck I was now using to read a math exam. All of it was, historically speaking, scheduled for demolition. I had transmigrated into a man on death row who didn't know he was on death row, and I had roughly 6 months before the food ran out and the whole country started sharpening things. So no, I was not worried about the math. I picked up the pen. Laplace himself was proctoring, Ferdinand Augustin Laplace, one of the greatest mathematicians who would ever live, standing there in person, probably expecting me to draw a horse in the margin. I went down the page, integrals, series, the mean behavior of continuous functions. To him it was the frontier of human knowledge. To me it was a Tuesday from a textbook I'd been beaten over the head with 2 centuries later. I answered everything, and then I hit a problem on Rolle's theorem, and this is the part where I got careless. Instead of the answer they wanted, I wrote down the more general version, the one that hadn't been discovered yet. The one they'd name after the man standing 3 feet away from me, except he hadn't thought of it because it was still the future. I realized my mistake about half a second after the ink dried, which is the traditional amount of time. Laplace came around the table. He read it. He went very still, the way people go still when they're deciding whether they're looking at a genius or a lunatic. This function, he said slowly, if it is continuous and differentiable, then between any 2 points, there exists. He stopped. He looked at me like I had reached into his skull and rearranged the furniture. Where did you learn this? It just seemed obvious, I said, which is the single most annoying sentence in mathematics, and I deployed it on purpose. Obvious. He laughed, a little unhinged. Are you another Leibniz? Then, quieter, almost to himself. If the difference of the function at the 2 ends is 0, you get Rolla. If it isn't, he grabbed for a pen. If it isn't, that's a new theorem entirely. That's your theorem, boy. Now go and prove it. Good luck. He wandered off muttering, a man who had come to fail a child and was leaving with homework. Across the room, this did not go over well with everybody. There was a boy about my age, sharp-faced, narrow-eyed, wearing enough gold thread to fund a small navy. Armand, the Duke of Chartres, son of the Duke of Vendôme. And if you don't know that name yet, don't worry, you'll be sick of it by the end of this. Armand shot to his feet and pointed at me and announced to the entire hall that I had cheated, that I couldn't possibly have done this, that someone must have written the answers for me. Laplace handed him my paper. Then read it, he said. Read the middle section aloud, Your Grace, and explain it to us. Armand looked at the page. The page looked back at Armand. And in the great silence that followed, it became extremely clear that this young man could not read a single line of it, and that the only thing he understood on the entire sheet was the humiliation now crawling up his neck. He put the paper down. His hands were shaking. He leaned toward me and said, low, so only I could hear it. You wait. I'll make you grovel for this. Cool. Great. Love that for me. Noted and filed. I gave him the polite, empty smile you give a dog that has just promised very sincerely to bite you someday. Because here's the thing about a body that history has already condemned. It does not have time for grudges from teenagers. It has a to-do list. Mine went like this. 1. France is 2 billion livres in debt against 500 million in income, which is the fiscal equivalent of being on fire while owing the fire money. 2. There's a famine coming in summer, and hungry people are how you get a revolution. 3. Half the nobility would happily sell the monarchy for parts. 4. Britain and Prussia are circling like they smell blood, because they do. And 5. The fun one. Everyone in this palace, including the sweet doomed people I was now supposed to call mother and father, was walking cheerfully toward a blade, and I was the only person in France who could see it coming. I had a cough too. The body came with a case of lingering pneumonia, because of course it did. The universe never gives you a cheat code without also handing you a lungful of 18th century phlegm. I folded my hands and I thought, all right, nobody's dying on my watch. Let's go save an empire nobody asked me to save, starting with the part where I have to convince my own mother to let me touch the money. The queen received me in her tea room, which smelled like sugar and money, and just faintly of a country quietly going bankrupt. Anastasia Isabel, my mother now, in every way that this new life counted, set down her cup and beamed at me because I had passed the exam, and to her that meant her sickly boy was blooming into something the court would finally respect. We had a deal, she and I. Pass the exam, prove I had a brain worth listening to, and I got to step into politics. So I stepped. I told her I wanted the Ministry of Finance, not a ceremonial seat, the real thing, the books, because everything else in France, the bread, the nobles, the war drums, my own personal appointment with the guillotine, all of it grew out of the same rotten root, and the root was money. The ministers in the room made the noise a room makes when a child asks to fly the plane. Oh, they gushed about me, sure. The boy is a gift from God, that kind of thing. They'd been doing it since the exam, but hand me the treasury, adorable. And then a voice, cool and flat, from a tall, thin man by the window. His Highness is 13, said the Duke of Vendôme. He has no experience. He should study a few more years. Reasonable, fatherly, utterly poisonous, because this was the man who, behind the smile, was quietly bankrolling every faction that wanted the crown gone. The man who dreamed of the throne for himself and was patient enough to wait for the whole family to fall into it. He wasn't protecting me from responsibility. He was blocking the one person who might fix the thing he was counting on to break. So I didn't back down. I looked at the most powerful noble in France, in front of the entire cabinet, and I informed him that Joan of Arc had led armies at 17, and I could at least be trusted to read a ledger. The room stopped breathing. You do not talk to the Duke of Vendôme like that. I had just done it in public on purpose, so that everyone would remember the boy had teeth. My mother, God bless her, found the compromise. Not finance, not yet. Start smaller, she said. Prove yourself in Paris. Then we'll talk about the treasury. She handed me the city. As for my father, Henri XVII was locked in his workshop for the third straight day, filing away at some new lock mechanism, and could not be reached for comment on his son's political career. That man loved two things in this world, his family and the inside of a padlock, in roughly that order, on a good day. Fine, Paris it was. I sent my 60-odd attendants and hairdressers home. A prince does not need a stylist to fix a bankruptcy. Climbed into a plain carriage and rode into the city I was supposed to save. Paris, up close, smelled like a crime and looked worse. I want to be clear about the standards of the era so you understand this isn't me being squeamish. There were dead animals in the Seine. There was sewage running open in the streets. There were robberies happening in daylight in the Louvre district, which was supposedly the safe part, the way a shark tank is the safe part of the ocean if you compare it to the other shark tank. This was the capital of the most glittering court in Europe, and the actual city was an open wound with shops on it. They threw me a welcome banquet at the city hall. I tried to talk about police reform. The mayor, a slippery man named Duplessis, and the head of the Chamber of Commerce spent the entire meal being somewhere else whenever I opened my mouth, a coordinated ballet of not hearing me. And then the doors banged open and a young woman came in screaming that a man named Leclerc hadn't killed himself, he'd been murdered, and the official cause of death was, I want you to sit with this, that he had swallowed a sword. Everybody at the table did the thing polite people do with a horror they'd rather not think about. Clucked, shook their heads, murmured about the tragedy, and reached for more wine. I put down my fork. He didn't swallow it, I said. The mayor blinked at me, finally, actually looking at me for the first time all evening. Your Highness? You can't accidentally swallow a sword, and you certainly can't force a sword down the throat of a 6-foot combat veteran who's fighting you. He'd break your arm first. I heard myself talking and realized 2 centuries of true crime documentaries watched on a couch in another life were about to earn their keep. The only way a man like that opens his mouth wide, tips his head back, and holds perfectly still while someone leans a metal instrument toward his throat is if he trusts them completely and expects it, which means he wasn't murdered by an enemy. He was murdered by his dentist. The table had gone quiet. Find the man's dentist. An Englishman, I'd wager, and I'd wager further that Leclerc wronged him personally, badly enough to plan a thing this patient. They stared at me like I'd pulled a rabbit out of the soup. 10 minutes of urgent whispered inquiry later, the details came back and lined up like soldiers. Yes, an English dentist, whose brother Leclerc had killed years ago in America, who had crossed an ocean and set up a practice and waited, taking his revenge one calm appointment at a time, with a bribed servant standing ready to swear it was suicide. My guard Marius ran him down before the cheese course was cleared. The dentist, regrettably, did not survive being caught. Case closed. I went back to my fish. The mayor did not ignore me for the rest of the meal. That night, the young woman, Leclerc's fiancée, took her own life to follow him and left 4,000 livres to me and to the police of Paris. It was the first money anyone had ever handed me in this life without an angle attached to it, given by a grieving girl who thought I was the only honest man in the room. I sat with that for a long time. I did not make a joke about it. Some things you just carry. Meanwhile, in a mansion called the Royal Palace, the Duke of Vendôme was deciding what to do about me. The Royal Palace was his fortress and his marketplace, the headquarters where he quietly funded the men who would one day storm everything, where you could buy banned weapons if you knew the right servant. His son, Armand, was there, beating a maid over a cup of tea that had gone lukewarm, working through the humiliation of the exam by making someone smaller than him pay for it. And the Duke made his plan, calm as a chess player. He wouldn't attack me directly. He'd promote me into a grave. He'd have the mayor appoint me police commissioner of the Saint-Jean district, the worst slum in Paris. The most crime, the least order, a place where good careers went to be strangled in an alley. Then he'd point every newspaper he owned at that district's misery and let the headlines do the rest. Soon, he told his son, in the eyes of the people, you'll be exactly as useless as your father. He meant the king. He always meant the king. He thought he was handing me a coffin. He was handing me a sandbox. The mayor did his part with a smile. The previous commissioner of Saint-Jean was suddenly on sick leave, and would I, your highness, be so very kind as to take the post? I would. I rode in to see my new kingdom, and my new kingdom was collecting protection money on the corner while two gangs bled each other out in the street, and not one policeman was anywhere to be found. The numbers were a horror show. Population 80,000. Last month alone, 28 murders, 63 robberies, 220 thefts. On paper, there were 181 police, 120 of whom had bought their jobs like season tickets, plus 200 unpaid civilian patrolmen who hadn't seen a wage in 4 months. Realistically, I had maybe 60 men who would do anything but run. The funding split was a joke with no punchline, a fifth from the city hall, 4/5 from the Chamber of Commerce, and both had quietly turned off the tap. So I sat down and wrote 4 pages of police reform, sent a rider for 20,000 livres of my own money, and had every last cop and patrolman in the district dragged into one courtyard to hear me out. 400 exhausted, unpaid, cynical men stood in that courtyard in the cold, and every one of them was looking at me the way you look at a rich child who's wandered in to waste your time. They'd been promised things before. Promises were the one thing the district had never run short of. I could see it on the face of the man nearest me, an old patrolman with a soldier's shoulders and a tanner's ruined hands, arms crossed, jaw set, already deciding I was nothing. So I didn't make a speech about honor. I made them 3 promises, and I made them specific because specific is the only kind of promise a poor man believes. 1. Every civilian patrolman in this district right now becomes a real salaried officer. A police post normally costs 500 livres to buy. I was giving it away free to men the system had used up and never paid. 2. From today there are ranks, constable, superintendent, sergeant, 3 grades each, and your pay climbs with your rank from 18 livres up to 40, based on what you actually do. 3. Every month we measure you. Cases solved, calls answered, complaints filed against you. Do well, you get a bonus. Coast, you get cut. And then I had 20,000 livres in hard coin carried out and stacked where they could see it, and I started paying the back wages on the spot. You have never heard a sound like 400 forgotten men realizing someone finally showed up. Long live the Crown Prince. They didn't see a 13-year-old. They saw the first person in years who had treated them like they were worth feeding. We built complaint boxes on the corners and 24-hour guard booths on the main streets, and I want to note, for the record, that Alexander would do a smaller version of this decades later and get called the father of the modern police. I did it in a slum in 10 days because I was in a hurry and I had a country to keep. The countermove came fast, because it always does. The mayor wasn't even angry, he was smug. Word went around that Saint-Jean had made cops out of beggars, which meant nobody would ever pay 500 livres for a job that got handed to gutter trash, which killed the single biggest income the police department had, the sale of positions. Then he'd choke the city hall funding entirely, starve the force, watch it panic, and let my own men be the ones who begged me to stop. Elegant, honestly. Cut off the blood and let the body do your murdering for you. My police commissioner, a viscount named Leclerc, came to talk me down like you'd talk down a boy who wants to keep a wild bear. The patrolmen can't fight, he said. They need 3-4 months of training. They have no equipment. Every problem he raised, I already had an answer for, and I gave it to him flat. I have a 10-day method. He left cold, having decided, I could see it on his face, to get me thrown out of Paris entirely. And then, right as the walls started closing in, a rider came from Versailles with a box of sweets from my mother and a letter from my father. I need to tell you about this letter because it broke something open in me. It was pure, goofy, fatherly love, and it did not have a single strategic thought in it. He spent the first paragraph bragging about a new lock he'd invented, the salamander spraying water. I am not making that up. And how the springs on it were a genuine breakthrough. Then he told me he'd heard I was reforming the police and that it was wonderful, and then he wrote the sentence I would end up leaning on more than any weapon I ever built. Just go ahead and do what you want, son. If anything goes wrong, I will cover for you. I will always support you. He signed off by kissing me 1,000 times. In my first life, my parents died while I was still at university. I had spent years being nobody's son, and here was this soft, strange, unbothered man who filed padlocks while his kingdom rotted, handing me, without being asked, the one thing I had stopped believing I'd get again. I read it twice. I put it in my coat, against my chest, where I'd keep it. And I made a quiet note that a king who says, "I'll cover for you," in his own handwriting, has just given his son a key that opens doors the son isn't supposed to touch yet. 10 days after that courtyard, my new police force walked into the street for the first time, and Paris had genuinely never seen anything like it. 280 officers in blue army surplus uniforms, decades ahead of what any European force would wear. And they weren't carrying muskets or sabers, they were carrying 2-meter Y-shaped wooden riot forks and shields, the exact non-lethal crowd control gear a modern riot squad would use to pin a man without killing him. 10 hours of drill a day, no complaints, because their kids were now eating white bread and meat for the first time. 50 investigators, 236 on patrol, the rest on staff. Their first real test came on Oral Street. The Viper gang had a debtor down on the cobbles and were methodically breaking his arm over some unpaid protection money in broad daylight, the way you'd break a stick, because that was simply how the district worked and had always worked, and no one had ever once come around the corner to stop it. Somebody came around the corner to stop it. One of my new officers was a man named Julian, an ex-tanner who 2 weeks earlier had been an unpaid patrolman watching his kids not eat, and who now wore a blue coat and earned 35 livres a month and could buy them white bread with meat in it, and who would, I promise you, have walked into cannon fire for the boy who did that for him. He led a squad around that corner in tight formation, riot forks leveled, shields up, exactly the way they drilled 10 hours a day for 10 days, while the whole district laughed at them for playing with sticks. The red-haired gang boss looked up from the arm he was breaking and laughed too. He had 10 years of knife work behind him and a reputation that cleared streets, and he drew his blade and came in fast and low the way that had always ended arguments before, and he discovered, in about 4 seconds, the thing that 10 years of knife fighting had never had to teach him. A knife needs to be close, and a 2-meter wall of poles does not let you get close. 2 forks took him in the legs and swept his feet out from under him before his blade was anywhere near a man to cut. He went down hard on the stones, and the forkheads pinned him there like a beetle on a card, and Julian's voice cracked out over the street the words I'd trained into them, the words that were about to mean something. In the name of the Crown Prince, charge! The rest of the Vipers scattered, and ran straight into the second thing they didn't understand about the new world. The corner had a guard booth now, manned around the clock, and the men in it stepped out and folded the exit shut, and the gang that had owned this street for years was, in the space of 2 minutes, face down on it. Then the strangest thing of the whole day happened. Doors opened. People came out of the houses they'd been hiding in, the ones who paid the protection, the ones who'd learned to look at the ground, and they didn't run. They brought my officers water. They brought them bread. An old woman pressed a cup into Julian's shaking hands and called him Monsieur, which no one had ever called an unpaid patrolman in his life. And by evening the whole district had learned a phrase, and by the end of the week the whole city had it, and it spread like a spell you could actually cast. If you are in trouble, if the wolves are at your throat, you shout in the name of the Crown Prince, and now, for the first time in living memory, the wolves back off. I heard about it that night at my desk. I did not smile exactly. I made a note, but I remember the note felt different from the others. Watching all this from across town, both of my enemies decided to stop playing nice. The Duke of Vendôme was genuinely furious now, because even his own newspaper had printed something admiring about me, and his plan to bury me in bad press had flipped over and complimented me instead. He began to suspect the Queen was using me as a scalpel to cut the rot out of his bureaucracy, which, honestly, give the man credit, that's close to true. He bought the mayor with the promise of a governorship and told him to stop me at any cost. And Leclerc, my own commissioner, ran his own play. He paid 30,000 livres to the 2 biggest gangs in the district, 1,000 livres per incident, 20,000 as a bonus if they could turn Saint-Jean into a screaming chaos within the month. If the district burned, I'd burn with it. He wanted a disaster with my name on it. He got a few days of one, a shoe store torched, 2 dead. Slashings on Massara Street, and then the real move. About 100 of my officers, a full quarter of the force, called in sick or with family trouble, on the same morning, led by Aldo, my own deputy. Beautiful, coordinated, and about as subtle as a brick through a window. I smelled the trap before I'd finished my coffee. I sent Khalil and a doctor to physically verify every single sick note in person and to fire, immediately, anyone whose deathbed turned out to be a tavern. Then I reached for the card I'd been keeping face down. I had 105 Crown Prince's guards. Elite, loyal, always within 300 meters of me, because that is the entire point of a bodyguard. I peeled off 90 of them and put them on patrol with my inspectors. My guard captain, Viscount Rochefort, nearly fainted. This is against every regulation. The king would never allow it. You cannot use the royal bodyguard to police a slum. And I reached into my coat and produced my father's letter in my father's hand. Just go ahead and do what you want. I will cover for you. The king's own words. Rochefort read it twice, went pale, and yielded, on the condition that a certain Major Beaumont never find out, and that I stay put in the station like a good prince. Sold. That letter was the best padlock my father ever made, and he made it by accident. The royal guard hit the streets in breastplates with muskets, and my orders were not gentle, because I had run out of gentle. This was the 18th century. There were no criminals' rights, no careful arrests, no lawyers. There were men who broke a debtor's arm in broad daylight because they were sure nothing would happen to them, and I had decided to change what they were sure of. Any criminal who resisted arrest and could not be taken alive, shoot him. That was the order. 2 Hosgang thugs knifed a man on the Masara road and ran off laughing, the way they always had, certain of it, and a volley of the king's muskets dropped them mid-laugh, face down on the cobbles, in front of a street full of people who had never once seen a gangster face a consequence. By 10 in the morning, 6 of them were dead. In one day, the Hosgang lost 17 men. And a wonderful thing happened to the mathematics of the district, which is that all the protection money in Paris turns out to lose its appeal the moment you're too dead to spend it. The gangs who had done these sums in blood their whole lives ran the new numbers overnight and went very, very quiet. But muskets are a scare, not a cure, titled Knights Get Bored, and they don't know the district. So while the guns bought me quiet, I followed the money. The gangs had been paid 1,000 livres a job by a man called Etienne, cousin of Barthélemy, my sick leave predecessor. Etienne had flashed a 20,000 livre deposit slip from a small outfit called the Haverly Bank. I went to that bank myself, leaned on the manager with the words "Secret Police," and got the name on the 30,000 livre draft that had funded the whole thing. Viscount Leclerc, my own police commissioner. No hard proof, though. Just a name on a bank draft, which a viscount could explain away over lunch. He could deny it all day and dare me to prove otherwise, and in a world where nobles answered to nobles, he'd win. So I decided not to prove what he'd done. I decided to make him do it again, out loud, where I could hear it. At 4 in the morning, I pulled the Queen's clerk and the head of the secret police out of their beds and laid out a play. That night, on a dark road, a carriage of gangsters, my agents in false beards, with a coerced real thug up front for authenticity, ran Leclerc's carriage down and climbed aboard to renegotiate the deal. And my undercover man, playing a greedy criminal who wanted more money, walked the police commissioner of Paris up the steps of his own gallows one comfortable sentence at a time. The price went up, my man said. The job's bigger than you said. The job is exactly what I said, Leclerc snapped, irritated, a man haggling. 10 dead policemen, the station burned to the ground, 20,000 livres, we agreed. And nobody's forcing you into this, because if there's a nobleman above you leaning on you, we deal with him, not you. No one is forcing me, Leclerc said, and I wish you could have heard the boredom in it, the pure administrative impatience, a man annoyed at having to repeat the grocery list. It's my money and my decision. Now do the job or get out of my carriage. My agent reached up and peeled off the beard. Viscount Leclerc, he said pleasantly, you're under arrest in the name of the royal police. There were 3 witnesses in and around that carriage who had heard every word. The Queen's own clerk, the driver, and a uniformed officer, which is 3 more than French law usually required to end a commoner, and, it turned out, just barely enough to end a viscount. Leclerc folded like a bad hand. He'd spent his whole life certain that men like him didn't get caught, because men like him made the rules about catching. He'd simply never met anyone willing to change the rules. In the headboard of his bed we found a notebook, every gang tie in the district, plus a meticulous record of his own protection rackets. 2 days of raids emptied every hideout, the cells overflowed, and the surplus went to the Bastille, with citizens blocking doorways to help us catch the runners. A reporter named Camille came sniffing for political prisoners, expecting to expose me. Instead, every shopkeeper he interviewed genuinely praised the reform. One who'd been squeezed for 5 livres a month by the Viper gang could suddenly afford butter for his kids, and Camille, who at least respected a fact when it bit him, wrote an honest headline in my favor. I filed that away because I knew exactly who Camille would become, and honest was not the word for it. 20 days in, a commendation letter signed by both the king and queen recalled me to Versailles. They missed their son. It also fit my plan like a glove. I'd cash the anti-gang win for the post of assistant finance minister. But somewhere on that ride, a bigger truth landed on me. Every reform I made minted a fresh enemy: bureaucrats, nobles, the church, the money men, foreign courts. The secret police were useless, house-trained lapdogs. What I needed was my own intelligence service, a real one, the kind that hears the knife being drawn before it reaches your back. The trouble was building one from nothing, with no political capital to spend. And then, right on cue, Interior Minister Count Valois happened to be on the same road and wanted very badly to greet me because Leclerc had been his protege, his appointment, and Valois was sweating about what the boy might say. He gave me a jeweled Persian knife. I saw a lever. In the carriage I played him like a cheap fiddle. He admired the weather. He admired my police work. And then, delicately, he fished. "This unpleasantness with Leclerc," he said. "A tragic case. Corruption, I hear. Bribery. He'll be, what, dismissed? Fined?" "Oh, it's worse than corruption," I said, watching the fields go by. "The charge is inciting riots." I let it sit there, because corruption is a fine and a scandal. Corruption is survivable. Inciting riots is a crime against the state, the kind that doesn't stop at the man who did it, the kind that reaches up the chain of everyone who sponsored and promoted and protected him, asking each one what they knew. And Leclerc's sponsor, the man who had appointed him and mentored him and vouched for him for years, was sitting across from me in a moving carriage, going the exact color of old cheese. Inciting. Valois' voice failed. He tried again. "Surely that's an exaggeration. A police commissioner hiring a few thugs to burn a government station and murder 10 of the king's officers?" I turned from the window and looked at him. "What would you call it, Count?" He didn't have an answer, because there was only one, and it had his career in it. I let him suffer for exactly as long as it took the carriage to cross a small bridge, and then I let a little mercy into my voice, because a trapped animal that sees no exit bites, and I didn't want to be bitten, I wanted to be thanked. "Of course," I said, "I'm the only one who really knows what happened in that district, the full picture, and a full picture can be drawn narrowly if the right people help me draw it. Leclerc, and Leclerc alone. A contained tragedy." I let him understand me. "I'd only need 2 small things from a friend." "Anything," he said, and meant it. "A drowning man not caring what the rope costs. Your voice, in the cabinet, for my appointment to finance. And your recommendation for the next police commissioner, a post that happens to be yours to fill." I smiled. Small things, between friends. He agreed so fast he nearly thanked me for blackmailing him, which is the sweetest kind of extortion there is. He climbed down at the crossroads pale and thoughtful, muttering that he hadn't felt this cornered since he'd stood before old King Antoine XV himself as a young man, and I could see the thought cross his face, quietly deciding that it might be time to put a great deal of distance between himself and his patron, the Duke of Vendôme, which was, of course, the other thing I'd bought. I kept the Persian knife. It really was a very nice knife. Versailles threw me a war hero's welcome, and this is where I have to introduce you to the single dumbest problem of my new life: the fainting girls. See, the moment God's chosen prince became famous, the noble daughters of the court developed a sudden, contagious, medically fascinating inability to remain standing in my presence. I would walk the receiving line, and one after another, these young women would go pale, sway, press the backs of their hands to their foreheads, and topple gracefully in my direction, timing the collapse so that a gentleman, ideally the prince would have to catch them. It was an epidemic. A dozen of them fainted at that one welcome. The entire hall reeked of vinegar-smelling salts, because they'd all soaked their handkerchiefs in advance, which is not, I'm told, how genuine unconsciousness is usually prepared for. My guard captain Rochefort, God love him, was a soldier and not a romantic, and he solved it the way a soldier solves everything. He scooped up 2 of the swooning maidens under his arms like sacks of flour and roared down the hall. "Guards, 2 ladies have collapsed. Fetch the physician quickly." And a stretcher, no, 2 stretchers. Both unconscious ladies stood bolt upright, cured, glaring at him with the pure hatred of women who have just been outmaneuvered in front of witnesses. Rochefort set them down gently and saluted. I had to look at the ceiling for a while. My mother reached me through the chaos and pulled me into an embrace, fretting that I was too thin, that Paris had worked me too hard. And then, because she could never let 10 minutes pass without it, floating the idea of an engagement, perhaps a Spanish princess, perhaps a Savoyard. My father leaned in and said wonderfully, in his mild way, "Pick a girl you actually like, Henri, even if she isn't a princess. That's the trick they don't tell you." Then my mother put her hand on my forehead and stopped and frowned. "You're burning up," she said. And the pleasant part of the day was over. Because the court physician, Dr. Moreau, took one look at my flushed face and reached for the thing every 18th century doctor reached for, which was a small sharp blade and a bowl. He was going to open a vein and let the bad blood out. I want to be clear that this was not malpractice by the standards of the day. This was the standard. This was the best medicine on earth in 1787, and the best medicine on earth in 1787 was make the sick person also bleed. A few years down the line, in a country that didn't exist yet, doctors would drain James Madison of half his blood over a sore throat and he would die of the cure, and everyone would agree they'd done everything possible. You are not, I said, sitting up, putting that knife in my arm. Your Highness, the fever must be released. The fever is my body fighting something. Your plan is to help it fight by removing the blood it needs to fight with. Do you hear how that sounds? He advanced with the bowl. I reached under my pillow and produced the jeweled Persian knife Valois had so recently given me and held it up and smiled. Doctor, I have a knife too. Mine's nicer. Let's both put ours away. He put his away. Then I dictated, from memory, the extraction of salicin from willow bark, the grandmother of aspirin 200 years early, to a scribbling secretary who clearly thought I'd gone delirious. And that was the exact moment the door opened, and the real prize of the evening walked in. Dr. Cuvier, the man who would one day father the theory of evolution, come to consult on the prince's fever, with an assistant at his shoulder, a green-eyed young woman of 17 or 18 in a man's hunting coat, whom he introduced curtly as my aide, and whose name I would learn later in a kitchen was Elise. Remember her, she matters more than the fever. Cuvier, being a real scientist and therefore twice as stubborn as Moreau, also wanted to bleed me, on firmer theoretical grounds and with a better bowl, so I made him a wager instead, because a scientist can't resist a test. My medicine, I said, brings this fever down within the hour. Your knife brings it down never, because bloodletting does nothing but make weak men weaker. We test both. Give my willow bark an hour. If I'm still burning, you may bleed me as much as you like, and I'll write you a letter praising your genius. If I'm not, I looked at him, you owe me an open mind. Deal? He took the bet the way a man takes a bet he's sure he's going to win. 37 minutes later, a thermometer read normal, my skin was cool, and Georges-Jean Cuvier was holding a paper twist of willow bark powder in both hands and staring at it like it was the philosopher's stone, whispering, how is this possible, and already asking, begging, to produce it at scale. The green-eyed aide in the corner was staring at me too, but differently, and I pretended not to notice. I told them all it had come to me by divine revelation, because the truthful answer, I read it in a chemistry textbook that won't be written for another 42 years, tends to end conversations and start exorcisms. That win bought my ticket into the cabinet, and the cabinet meeting is where the real war started. Valois stood up, as promised, and proposed me for assistant finance minister. Lomini, the finance minister and chief minister both, backed it, keeping the final word on money for himself. And then the Duke of Vendôme, of all people, supported me too, warmly, which is how I knew it was a trap, because that man had never handed me anything that wasn't wired to explode. Sure enough, 6 million livres in government bonds came due the next month, and he'd quietly arranged for the banks to suspend every loan to the crown so that the fresh new assistant finance minister could preside over France defaulting on its debt. Headline writes itself. Boy Prince bankrupts France. They gave me the portfolio anyway, loans, debt, tax law, and at the very next budget meeting I detonated the room on purpose, because I needed everyone to understand fast that the boy was not going to be predictable. I moved to shelve every battleship under construction. All of them. The Navy minister, Bouillet, came up out of his chair like the seat had bitten him. His grandfather had been humiliated by the British Navy, avenging that with a great French fleet was his life's whole meaning, and here was a 13-year-old canceling his warships to save money. I let him rage, and then I explained gently, the thing no French admiral wanted to hear. No matter how hard we build, we cannot outbuild Britain at sea. 2 of our ships to their 1, worse crews, worse gunnery. We would pour the treasury into a fleet and they would sink it, and in the history I couldn't cite, that is exactly what happened, at a place called Trafalgar. What I also couldn't say aloud, in a room full of men who'd have called for a physician, was the real reason. I didn't want wooden ships because I was going to build iron ones, driven by steam, and I refused to spend gold on a fleet I intended to make obsolete. I found Bouillet afterward, privately, because you don't leave a proud man bleeding in public if you can recruit him instead, and I painted him a ship. Imagine a hull of iron, I said. No wind needed. It moves on its own, on steam, 20 knots against the tide. 50 guns, some of them throwing 42-pound shot. It doesn't dodge the weather. It doesn't wait for the line of battle. It goes where you point it, and nothing wooden that Britain owns can stand in front of it. He laughed at me, of course. Then he stopped laughing, because I wasn't, and I told him I would begin building it within 3 years, and I asked him to keep faith until then. The Navy Minister of France left that conversation trembling, an old man who'd just been handed his grandfather's revenge on a timeline, and he became mine. Then I flipped the whole table the other direction and argued to increase our aid to the Dutch patriots against Prussia. for the Rhine outlet, for the trade, for the coal and iron, and to bleed Prussian troops now on ground I chose, because war with Prussia was coming whether the cabinet believed it or not. Half the room decided I was secretly pro-British, the other half decided I was anti-Prussian. A thoughtful minority privately concluded I was a very small lunatic. My father, bless him, simply pledged 600,000 livres to the Dutch on the spot because I'd asked him to, and he trusted me. And underneath all of it, the tax bill I needed most sat rotting in the High Court, the aristocrat-run court that was, in the history I remembered, the literal fuse of the whole revolution. The British ambassador sat in the corner taking careful notes on every word I said. Everyone was always taking careful notes on me. I was getting used to it. After the meeting, my mother cornered me and told me to stop the police reform. The salaries were too high, the city hall couldn't pay, and she'd figured out I'd been covering the gap from my own pocket. I refused to let it die. Security wasn't a luxury, it was the floor everything else stood on, and I wanted it citywide, then nationwide. So she gave me a deadline instead of a grave, 6 months to fund those salaries myself, or the whole thing rolled back. I told her I was confident. I did not tell her why, because steam engines, steel, rubber, and firearms is not a sentence you say to your mother in 1787. I said finance, real estate, luxury goods, which was technically true. She lent me 2 vetted men, Lanz, a sharp trade hand, and Duval, an ex-company commander, and I turned them into the seeds of an empire. Lanz became Paris police commissioner, tasked with spreading the reform citywide out of a rulebook I wrote. Duval became the dean of a new institution, the Paris Police Academy, which was not a police academy. I mean, it was, but it was also a machine for growing my own people. I taught the cadets finance, trade, journalism, and law. Your police must be more professional than your criminals. Because what I was actually building was a factory for loyal officials who would one day run this country and call me principal. Wampoa, if you know your history. A whole generation raised to be mine. The bill for all this was ugly, 50,000 livres a month in salaries against a city hall budget of 8,000 plus 20,000 to start the academy. My personal fortune went from over 200,000 livres to about 100 and kept falling, which meant I needed money, fast, and I needed it from a source that would never run dry. Women's money. I know how that sounds. Hear me out. The salicin I'd been making to save the poor, capped under 3% profit, sometimes bartered for willow bark, genuine mercy for people who couldn't afford a doctor. That same compound, salicylic acid, was also a superb skin treatment, acne, complexion, all of it. So I took a fraction of the factory's output, the high-purity stuff, mixed it with glycerin and rose oil, and a little beeswax, and made 50 bottles of a face cream I called Angel Water, after a product a company would sell for a fortune 2 centuries later. Cost me about $1 a bottle. I priced them at 15. I sent 40 to a luxury shop and 10, free, to my mother, because the single most valuable endorsement in France was, "The Crown Prince made this himself." As the great sage of my old world once said, the easiest money in the world to earn is the money of women and children. He built a trillion-livre empire on that sentence. I was going to build a police force on it. It went off like a bomb. The Queen tried it, loved it, passed it to an acne-prone maid, then a duchess, then everyone, and because the beloved prince had mixed it with his own divine hands, the noble ladies of France lost their entire minds. A snobbish shop refused to carry it and missed the gold rush of the decade. A bidding war broke out at another store. 5 bottles went for 150 livres. 40 bottles I'd expected to clear 600 livres brought in 1,460. I looked at that number and I thought calmly, my heart is not black enough. So I rebuilt the whole thing. 3 price tiers, face masks, hand cream, toner, gold and silver membership cards, an actual registered company, the Paris Angel Trading Company, and the secret ingredient stayed locked in my hands alone. Even Cuvier, who made the salicin, had no idea it was going into cosmetics. If every person I employed betrayed me tomorrow, not one of them could reproduce a single drop. I kept Cuvier too, and not with a raise. He was about to sail to South America on a grant, so I baited him with something better than money. I told him to build me penicillin. I didn't call it that. I described it. A drug that cures pneumonia, infected wounds, childbed fever, sepsis, the diseases that killed 9 soldiers for everyone who died in battle. A war-winning miracle. I dangled vitamin E for the cosmetics line as an appetizer and the miracle drug as the main course, promised him a constant temperature laboratory cooled by Seine water through underfloor pipes, and he was mine. His daughter's situation, I handled differently. Because his daughter was Elise, and Elise is where this story grew a heart. The night I truly got to know her, not Cuvier's silent green-eyed aide from the fever, but her, I nearly got her shot. It was past midnight. I couldn't sleep. 2 billion livres of debt does that to a person, and I'd gone down to the palace kitchens to find something to eat like a normal human being instead of ringing a bell and making 6 people wake up to hand me a grape. I pushed open a dark door, and in the one thin blade of moonlight from the window, I saw a figure with long hair hanging over its face, hunched over the table, holding a red, dripping dagger above something small and wet and dead. I would like to tell you I assessed the situation with the cool logic of a future statesman. What I actually did was scream and throw myself backward into the doorframe hard enough to bruise my own shoulder, and my night guards came pounding in behind me with muskets up, because their 13-year-old prince had just made a noise usually reserved for people being murdered. "Don't shoot," the figure shrieked, throwing both hands in the air, dagger and all. "Don't. I'm a person. I'm a person. Please." The hair fell back. It was a young woman, green eyes, enormous with terror, in a man's hunting coat 3 sizes too big. On the table in front of her was a rabbit, opened neatly along the belly, its organs laid out in a tidy row like a diagram in a book, because that was exactly what it was. A diagram. She'd been dissecting it. I said, my heart still trying to climb out through my ears. "You're Cuvier's aide, from the night of my fever." "Elise." She said it fast, rigid with terror, both hands still in the air. "My name is Elise. Please don't tell my father." It came out of her in one breath. "Please, Your Highness, I know how it looks, I know, but I wasn't. It's a rabbit. It's just a rabbit. I bought it from the kitchen. I paid for it." "You paid for a rabbit so you could cut it open in the dark at midnight," I said. "Why?" And here's where she stopped being frightened and started being angry, which is when I started actually liking her. She lifted her chin. "Because it's the only time no one can stop me. Women aren't permitted to study medicine, Your Highness. Not the university, not the anatomy hall, not the operating table. My father lets me assist him, in men's clothes, so the patients don't panic. But the moment there's a blade to be held over a living body, it goes into a man's hand, always, every time, even when the man in question couldn't find the liver with a map and I could do it blind." Her voice cracked and she pushed on through it. "He says no one marries a female doctor. He says I'll ruin myself. So I hold the instruments. I hand them over. I watch." She looked down at the rabbit, and her jaw set. "And at night I buy a rabbit so that at least once a day my hands get to do the thing they were made for. That's the whole crime, Your Highness. That's it." I stood there in a kitchen at midnight looking at a girl who wanted to heal people so badly she was committing petty larceny against the palace rabbit supply to do it, and something in me that had been all strategy for weeks went quiet. "Anatomy is the foundation of all of medicine," I said. "Everything real starts with knowing what's actually inside a body instead of guessing. You're not ruining yourself. You're doing the one thing every doctor in France is too squeamish or too lazy to do properly." I nodded at her neat row of rabbit organs. "That's good work. Keep going. And keep going in daylight, because I'm going to change the law." She blinked. "The law. Women in medicine. I'll write it into legislation. It'll take time, and it'll make 100 old men furious, which is how I'll know it's working." I meant it, and she could hear that I meant it, which I think frightened her more than the muskets had. "You're going to be France's first female doctor, Elise. On the record, with a certificate some fossil will have to sign whether he likes it or not." She looked at me the way you look at someone who has just handed you back a life you'd already dug a grave for. Her eyes went bright and wet, and she turned quickly away and pretended to be very busy wiping the dagger, and to give her a moment I said something about being hungry, and she, this fierce girl who'd just bared her whole soul over a dead rabbit, immediately, reflexively, made me foie gras in red wine, because that is apparently what she did with her hands when her heart was too full to speak. I made her sit down and share it instead of standing there watching me eat like I was some king and she was furniture. I promised her a doctor's coat cut to fit her, her own, not borrowed from a man. And the next morning she came to do my checkup without the dull gray face powder she usually wore to look older and plainer, and halfway through counting my pulse, she happened to actually look at my face, went the exact scarlet of the wine from the night before, dropped my wrist, and fled the room like a startled deer, pausing once at the door to glance back, which is the part that told me everything. So that was happening now too. I filed it under good problems, a category in which I did not, at that point, have many entries. Then I went back to war, because the tax bill was still dying in the high court, and I decided to stop being polite about it. Everyone before me had tried to appease the nobles, trim the bill, beg the court, concede and concede. I did the opposite. I stripped out every tax that hurt commoners and small businesses, turning the bill from a thing the nobles could bargain over into a thing that only bled the nobles, and then I made them angry on purpose. The matador's red cape. An enraged bull charges blind and makes mistakes. Submit the trimmed bill, let the court reject it, and then take it to the papers. Publish one tax item every single day, in plain language, who pays and who benefits, and hold it in the sunlight until public opinion belonged to me and not to them. Lomini, who'd lose his job by year's end if this failed, decided to go all in and shield my name as the author. Good man. Doomed timeline, but good man. Meanwhile, across the border, my other long game was tightening. In Amsterdam, my envoy pushed the Dutch patriots to break off their peace talks and hold the city for 5 days, backed by 300 French volunteer artillerymen and 2,000 muskets and cannons conveniently stolen from French warships, so that officially France had given nothing but that 600,000 livres. The whole thing was bait. The exiled Princess Wilhelmina had staged her own kidnapping to justify calling in 20,000 Prussian troops, and my agents were already in position at Nijmegen to grab her when she went to church that Sunday. A 13-year-old's grand strategy, executed by grown professionals across 3 countries, and not one of them knew the whole board but me, which, honestly, was the theme of my entire life now. I was the only one who could see the whole board. It was exhausting, and it was the only thing keeping the guillotine in the future where it belonged. The Dutch board resolved itself exactly the way I'd drawn it on a map in Paris, hundreds of kilometers from a single shot being fired, which is the strangest way there is to win a war. The Prussian vanguard came on under a young, ferocious officer named Scharnhorst. Remember that name. He outlives this entire story by decades and comes back at the worst possible moment, and he chased my beaten Dutch recruits to the shore of Lake Abcoude. And Prussian drill was every bit as terrifying as its reputation. 5 volleys to our 3, near simultaneous, tearing gaps in the raw Dutch line like a comb dragged through wet paper. So the Dutch broke, on schedule, exactly on schedule. Because a rout you planned is not a defeat, it's a door, and when my Green Dutchmen fell back in good order instead of scattering, they pulled aside like a curtain and unmasked 12 heavy cannon that had been sitting silent the whole time, and those 12 guns turned Scharnhorst's triumphant pursuing columns into a very bad afternoon in the space of about 4 minutes. Meanwhile, Pierre, first real command, sweating through his coat, holding on to the single fact that this was the Crown Prince's plan, and the Crown Prince's plans worked, took 200 French and 600 Dutch horse and went hunting the Prussian supply line, burned the wagons, burned the depots, made himself such a screaming nuisance in the enemy's rear that the great Duke of Brunswick, commander of the whole invasion, had to peel off entire regiments and send them chasing one nervous cavalry officer 20 kilometers in precisely the wrong direction, away from the battle that mattered. That's the thing generals forget, and quartermasters never do. An army is a mouth, and a mouth that isn't fed stops biting. It came down to the wire. Our shells ran out at 2 in the afternoon of the last day. The French gunners fixed bayonets and went in as infantry. Pierre was lining up a suicide charge straight at the Prussian guns when the enemy bugle sounded retreat instead, because that was the moment Frederick IV's envoy confirmed the thing the whole war had actually been about. Princess Wilhelmina was not with the Dutch. Her kidnapping by Italian bandits had been staged, she'd been publicly rescued by the Antwerp police, and she was safely back in Prussia, which meant Prussia's excuse for the whole invasion had evaporated in front of every court in Europe. The broke, embarrassed Prussians went home. The Dutch parliament even took the exiled William V back as a purely ceremonial figurehead, my suggestion, because a rival you keep on a shelf where you can see him is worth 10 you've driven into someone else's arms. Pierre wept when he understood what we'd pulled off. He's a son of God, he told his men. He really did it. I'd take the credit. Somebody in this story had to. While I was winning a war by mail, the Champs-Élysées flagship opened and I met 2 people who'd matter. The opening was a circus, angel water, you deserve it, across every front page, a ribbon, and me escaping the adoring ladies out the service exit like a man fleeing a fire. In the alley behind the store, I found the first person, a starving boy, maybe 8, counting coppers to buy a prince's blessing pill. That's what the poor had started calling the cheap salicin, for his little sister's fever. I gave him the coins and the pills, and then I gave him something better than charity, a job. Rent out chairs to the queue, stand in line for the rich. Personal shop for the ladies who couldn't be bothered, a livre a task in front of the busiest store in France. By the end of the month, that boy had a crew of 6 kids, a rented house, and was learning to read. You want to end poverty, you don't hand out fish. You build a fishing industry and put a child in charge of it. The second person was watching me do it. A veiled woman with legs that went on for a paragraph, who I'd later learn called herself Sorel, an anti-monarchy idealist who did crimes for freedom and justice, not for money, and who watched me tip a beggar and thought against her will that maybe not every royal was a venomous snake. She then proceeded to burglar pick her way into my company's headquarters, slip past my doorman like a cat, and, this is the part I love, completely failed to resist buying an armful of product and a 200 livre VIP card on her way out. Revolutionary principles are strong. Angel water is stronger. I didn't know her name yet. I'd be very glad later that she existed. Day 1 of the flagship did 126,000 livres and sold out by 5:30 because I deliberately stocked only 95% of demand. Scarcity is a feature, not a bug. Franchise offers poured in. I opened exactly 3 in Paris, 2 kilometers apart, and sold them for 150,000 each to a stampede of nobles, including a young viscount named Baudouin, whose textile fortune had been gutted by cheap British cloth under the Eden Treaty, and who bet 300,000 on the theory that only optimists get rich. My franchise manager Brent became a millionaire in a week off his 3% cut, and every round-the-clock construction site became a free advertisement because the whole city stood around watching Paris Angels get built like it was theater. Then the Duke's loan trap finally snapped shut, and I want you to appreciate how satisfying the next part is. 6 million in bonds, due, and every bank in France, La Ville, La Baude, the lot, suddenly regretted they couldn't roll over the routine loan. 2 weeks to a national default with my name on it. I toured the big houses. All closed. Best offer, 600,000 at 25%, which is not a loan, it's a mugging with paperwork. So I looked at this beautifully coordinated financial ambush and I said the sentence I'd been waiting my whole new life to say, fine. Then I'll open my own bank. France didn't even have a central bank. The old Royal Bank had been blown up by a Scotsman named Robert Maxwell decades earlier, and the whole country was still traumatized about paper money. Perfect. I took a small bank I'd quietly bought, renamed it the French Reserve Bank, and I capitalized it with the one thing Vendôme never accounted for, the obscene, gushing, women's money river of Paris Angels. I took the company public, shares at 1 livre, then a hired American trader, who was actually my man surrounded by royal guards, ramped the price against himself, 2, 3, 4 livres, while I dumped 200,000 original shares for 6 million. I invited the finance minister, the interior minister, and the head of the king's secret police to invest in the bank, dangling pre-IPO Angel shares as the hook, and they bought in. Not for their money, I had money, but for their power, which is the only asset in France I couldn't manufacture. The king and queen each took 5%. Prince Montmorency, who owned army influence, and the Duke of Provence, the king's hardline brother, each put in 400,000. I wasn't collecting cash. I was collecting the entire establishment as shareholders in my survival, and then I signed the 6 million livre government loan as assistant finance minister on one side of the table and as owner of the French Reserve Bank on the other. I loaned France 6 million from myself at 15% to myself. The bond got repaid on time. The default headline died in the printer, and the Duke of Vendôme discovered that a 13-year-old had raised 6 million livres out of thin air and a face cream, had already bought and renamed the mystery bank days before, and had turned the trap inside out so cleanly that Vendôme had to go apologize to his own bankers and buy them off with British business to keep them quiet. He finally understood what I was. I wasn't a precocious boy anymore. I was cracking, one by one, the 3 pillars his family had spent generations prying loose from the crown. Public opinion, finance, and the military, and the Reserve Bank meant the monarchy had just taken finance back, so he did the natural thing. He convened the Bankers Guild at a hunting lodge and declared war, boycott the Reserve Bank, oust Loménie from finance, install the famous banker Turgot in his place, and kill Paris Angels' stock license at the root. My loyal police commissioner Lannes, meanwhile, ran his own unauthorized revenge on the 2 banks that had refused me, sent the roughest ex-cops to protect them from imaginary robbers, scaring off every customer, extorting the managers, digging 4-meter anti-tunnel pits in their lobbies that the banks had to pay for, and planting newspaper stories about a bandit gang until 3 days passed with 0 customers. I never ordered a word of it. He just knew I was angry, and he loved me. That's the thing nobody in Vendôme camp had, people who'd burn a bank down for them out of love. But the real trophies from this stretch weren't financial. They were 3 men, and I'd been hunting them. At the victory ceremony for the Dutch War, mining the reports, I found that the brilliant tactics behind our win had been drawn up by a quiet captain named Murat, Henri-Claude Murat, who in the history I remembered would become Alexander's chief of staff, the greatest staff officer Europe ever produced. And Pierre's little brother, still in military school, was Jean-Luc Ney, the Iron Marshal, the one general Alexander never saw lose. I was standing in a room slowly filling up with Alexander's marshals, and Alexander himself was somewhere out there, 19 years old, unfound. So I started collecting. I recruited Leclerc to secretly research military reform, national conscription, a real war ministry, an honor culture, weapons development, military hospitals, the whole modern apparatus. Surpass Prussia, don't imitate it. And my police academy quietly became the first stake of an army that would answer to me and no feudal lord. Because I knew the ugliest fact in French history. During the Revolution, King Henry XVII could not summon a single loyal regiment to save his own life. Every soldier belonged to some noble. I was not going to die that way. I was building men who, when everything burned, would look at me and not at their duke. The last one I found by trapping him, which felt appropriate because he'd spend the rest of his life trapping other people. There were 2 men named Ferdinand Tallard that my spy turned up in 2 days, both clergymen, both plausible, and I couldn't tell from paper which was the one I remembered from history, so I tested them. I sent each the same confidential order, supposedly from a superior. A group of foreign agents needed to quietly, deniably die, and here was the poison. Arrange it. The first Tallard came back appalled. He would not, could not, take a life by stealth. It was against God and conscience. He begged to be excused. A good man. Wrong man. The second Tallard came back with a plan. An elaborate, cheerful, beautifully detailed plan involving a dinner, a specific wine, staggered dosing so the deaths would look like a bad oyster rather than a murder, and a contingency in case one guest didn't drink. He'd clearly enjoyed writing it. He asked, almost as an afterthought, whether he might keep the leftover poison for future efficiencies. It's him, I said. Ferdinand Tallard. The most gifted, most slippery, most bottomlessly treacherous spy master the age would ever produce. A man who, in the history I knew, personally betrayed every single regime and patron he ever served, and outlived nearly all of them by doing it. I hired him on the spot and gave him a free hand and 500,000 livres to build me an intelligence service out of the sharp police I'd cut loose, the universities, the postal clerks who read everyone's mail anyway. I knew exactly what I was buying. A vulture is a repulsive bird, right up until the hour you need something stripped to the bone with no witnesses, and then there is simply nothing better in all of nature. Useful now. Watched always. Replaceable the day he stopped being useful. I'd hold my new spy master the way you hold any knife you've grabbed by the blade, carefully, and never against my own skin. Vendôme's next move against me was to plant a spy in my life, and it turned into the single most humiliating night of my new existence, which is a competitive category. He paid a glamorous socialite named Madame Delacroix to worm her way close to me and manufacture a scandal, get inside the household, catch me in something the papers could hang me with. To get access, she engineered a gender swap masquerade for St. Nicholas Day, and this is how I ended up in a black gown, a corset, and a wig, at a party where my mother wore a swordsman's outfit and a fake mustache, and my father wore a dress and worked a fan like he'd been born to it. The genius of a gender reversal ball is that now the love-struck noble girls could ask me to dance, and they did, all of them, at once. I knew exactly one dance, the sarabande, and I performed it for an hour straight while trampling the feet of every partner in a slow, dignified Brownian motion. Delacroix could not get through the wall of girls to spring whatever she'd planned. Elise finally extracted me by loudly invoking my pneumonia, and I fled into the garden swearing a sacred oath never to attend a ball again. I would break that oath many times. A prince's promises to himself are worth exactly nothing. But the garden had its own drama, because that's where I found Pierre mid-duel. Pierre you've met, my elder Ney, the cavalry officer who'd burned the Prussian supply lines in Holland. He was in love with a young woman named Sophie, daughter of the Duke of Guise, great-granddaughter of the great Marshal Guise himself. And that love was a dead end, because Sophie's grasping cousin controlled the family fortune and was forcing her to marry his own son Julian with a debt over her mother's head as the leash. I came around a hedge, still in my black gown, and found the whole ugly little play in progress. Julian, somehow still wearing his ridiculous flower girl costume from the ball, standing over Pierre with a sneer. A penniless soldier, Julian was saying, with a captain's pay and a borrowed sword, and you think you'll marry into the house of Guise? Go back to your barracks, boy. Sophie marries a man with a name. Pierre took off his glove and threw it at Julian's feet. Jean-Pierre Duval, he said very quietly, which is the most dangerous way a soldier can say anything, and I'm challenging you. Julian laughed, because he was a major with a real regiment, and Pierre was a poor man with a grudge, and he drew. What men who buy their commissions never understand is that Pierre had actually been in battles, had actually killed men trying to kill him, and a furious veteran beats a smug amateur nearly every time. Within a dozen exchanges, Pierre was driving him back across the lawn, and Julian's sneer was gone, and it was about to get bloody, and then Sophie, who'd been screaming for them to stop, did the thing terrified people in love always do. She ran between the blades. A tip caught her arm. She cried out. Both men froze. I'd had enough. I stepped out of the shadows, still, I remind you, in a corset and a woman's gown, which did nothing for my authority and everything for the story, and made a wager loud enough for the whole garden to hear. If Pierre and Sophie are formally engaged by tomorrow evening, I announced, Julian kisses Pierre's boots, here, in front of everyone, and if they're not, Pierre kisses his. Julian looked at the strange girl in black who'd interrupted his duel and laughed again because it was impossible. The Villards would sooner die than hand Sophie to a nobody, and everyone knew it. Agreed, he said, delighted. I'll wear clean boots. I turned to Pierre and dropped my voice, letting just enough of the real me through the disguise that his eyes went wide because he almost placed it. Trust me, I told him. A friend of mine is very good at divining these things. The next morning I made the impossible thing possible in about 30 minutes, over tea, without raising my voice. I sat down with Sophie's mother, a proud woman being slowly strangled by a cousin who held her debts, and I offered her a trade no cornered noblewoman could refuse. Marry Sophie to Pierre, I said. He'll be my trusted guard officer within the month, raised to Viscount and then Earl on his own merit, and I'll back him with a 50,000 livre loan at no interest. And in return, I will help you take back everything your cousin stole, the Guy's estates and the Moulin's infantry regiment your family used to command. She looked at me, this powerless woman being handed a sword, and she said yes before the tea had cooled. She threw a ball 2 days later and announced her daughter's engagement to a man nobody in that room had ever heard of, and the court gasped, and across the floor, Julian went the color of curdled milk, because a wager is a wager, and everyone had witnessed it. He knelt. In front of the entire court of Versailles, the smug major in his clean boots got down on the marble and kissed Pierre's, and Pierre, who had been mocked as a penniless nobody the night before, stood there and let him, and did not gloat, which is the only thing that made it bearable to watch, and the reason I knew I'd chosen my man correctly. Pierre took his real orders from me later, in private, retake the Guy's power, and forge the Moulin's regiment into an elite legion. One more regiment that would, someday, look at me and not at any duke. And Delacroix's honey trap, the whole reason I'd been in that garden in a dress, it collapsed into pure farce, because Vendôme's own son had spent the night trailing me to catch me in a scandal, and instead blundered directly into the compromising trap his own father had built for me, and tangled himself in it beyond saving. I did not lift a finger. Sometimes the snare just closes on the trapper's boy, and the only correct thing to do is stand very still and smile. Tallard, meanwhile, followed the money all the way home, through Leclerc's mistress to the Mayor Duplessis, and from Duplessis' faction to its patron, and the patron was, of course, the Duke of Vendôme, who had also openly asked the Bankers' Guild to stall my loan. So now I had it, chapter and verse, every knife in my back for months traced to one hand. I resolved to remove that hand from the game entirely, but I couldn't just arrest the first prince of the blood on a spy master's say-so. I had to break the thing his power actually rested on, and his power rested on the press. That was the war I'd been losing without noticing. Overnight, every paper in Paris turned on my tax bill with beautiful, lying spin, the king's arbitrary new tax, a triumph for freedom, whenever the noble-run court blocked it, and the censors, who answered to that same court, looked the other way. Only Camille's column kept explaining the bill honestly, which is a sentence I still can't believe I get to write. The future terror of the revolution was, at this moment, the one honest man defending the king's tax. My sister Sylvie came storming home from convalescence in a fury over rumors that she'd taken a Prussian lover, and my secret police chief told me flatly there was nothing to be done, no explicit insult to prosecute, no court that would back force, and force just spawns 10 pamphlets for every one you burn. And I understood, all at once, the exact mechanism by which Henri XVII would one day go to the blade with no one raising a voice for him. The crown had lost the story, not the argument, the story. And you cannot suppress a story. You can only tell a better one, louder, to more people. So I stopped trying to gag the press and started trying to own it. Audience is the whole of power. I'd remembered from my old life a novelist who saved a dying newspaper by serializing one addictive story in it until the whole city bought the paper just to find out what happened next. So I reviewed all 57 papers in Paris and bought the smallest, cleanest, most desperate one, the Paris Business Daily, owned by a grateful, drowning man named Rossi, who couldn't believe a prince wanted his failing rag. Then I gave it 2 weapons from the future, and the first one I took to my father's workshop because it was the kind of thing only he could love properly: lithography. Offset printing. Instead of engraving a copper plate over 2 or 3 days, you draw on a flat limestone block with a grease pencil, wash it with acid and water so the ink sticks only where the grease is, and print. I set it up on my father's workbench, under oaths of confidentiality stern enough that the craftsman went pale, and I ran a plate start to finish in about an hour. My father watched the finished sheet come off the stone and made a sound I'd never heard him make about anything except locks. "An hour," he said. He picked up the sheet. He held it to the light. He turned it over. "The copper engravers take 3 days. You did it in an hour. With grease? And a rock?" "Grease and a rock and some acid, father." "May I see the stone again?" He was already bent over the workbench, not really asking, his big, careful hands moving over the limestone the way they moved over a lock mechanism, and I watched the best craftsman in France, the man everyone at court thought was a harmless fool who played with padlocks while his kingdom rotted, light up like a boy on his birthday, because for once in his life, the thing he was good at was going to matter. "The roller's uneven," he muttered. "You're getting ghosting at the edge. If I put a spring here and a counterweight, Henri, I could double your speed. Let me have it for 3 days." "It's yours," I said. We called it the King's Printing Press. He was so proud of it. He told my mother about it at dinner for a week. He had, at that moment, absolutely no idea that in the history I came from, the machine that would define his name was a different one entirely, a device for cutting heads off cleanly, patented in his reign. I gave him a printing press instead. I have never in either of my lives regretted anything less. The second weapon was the one I'm proudest of, because it's the pettiest thing I ever did to save a monarchy. I needed content so addictive people would line up in the rain for the next installment, because a newspaper nobody reads can't move public opinion no matter how true it is. And I knew exactly where to get content that overrides the human will, because I'd spent an entire past life having my brain eaten by it. So I gathered 4 of the best writers in France, and one of them was Voltaire, the man who wrote The Marriage of Figaro, arguably the sharpest playwright alive, and I sat these titans of French letters down and dictated to them, from memory, the plots of the trashiest, most magnificent web novels I'd ever binged at 3 in the morning in a life 2 centuries away. The flagship was breaking through the heavens. A young genius loses his power. His fiancée publicly dumps him for it. His whole world writes him off as garbage. And then, slowly, brutally, he claws his way back up toward godhood, and everyone who spat on him has to watch. I gave them the beats, the humiliation, the training in secret, the return, and I gave them the line, the one that would be screamed from theater stages and sobbed over in salons across the entire country. 30 years the Seine runs east. 30 years it runs west. Do not humiliate a young man for his poverty. Voltaire wrote it down. Then he stopped writing and looked up at me, and I watched the exact moment the hook went into the greatest playwright in France, the same hook that had gotten me at 3 in the morning, working on him just as well. And then what happens? He said. That's the end of the chapter, I said. No, you can't stop there. What happens to the ring, does he? He caught himself. He was a grown man, a genius, a legend, and he was leaning across my desk begging a 15-year-old for the next installment of a story I'd stolen from the future internet. Your Highness, he said, with as much dignity as he could scrape together, when may I have the rest? I paid them 2 livres per 500 words. The masters of French literature, helplessly, gloriously addicted to my recycled internet garbage, cranking out cliffhangers as fast as their hands could move. If I accomplished nothing else in this entire life, no reforms, no saved family, I gave France that, and I regret precisely none of it. The papers detonated. The Business Daily ran the novel on page 2, and my tax law on page 3. A sister paper ran the law with the Queen's fashion advice and the day's gossip, both priced at half the going rate, delivered by newsboys, which was itself an invention nobody here had thought of. Entertainment-starved Paris went feral. 7,000 copies each, sold out by 3 in the afternoon, obliterating the old record. Salons formed around fictional characters. And in between the cliffhangers, quietly, relentlessly, in plain language, a laborer could follow. The actual argument seeped into 100,000 heads. The nobles should pay their taxes, and the judges blocking it are only protecting their own exemptions. I didn't win the debate. I drowned it in story until the debate was over. I even managed to turn the British ambassador's seduction attempt into a 7-year time bomb. Hastings, the ambassador, took me to the theater, to a stage version of my own web novel, adapted in 3 days because theaters here moved faster than governments, and pitched me Anglo-French friendship and a shipbuilding treaty designed to keep France's navy permanently smaller than Britain's. I ignored the ships and hijacked the whole conversation to the Eden Trade Treaty. I proposed to further cut tariffs, generously, but first to temporarily raise French industrial tariffs to 25%, then taper them down to 5 over 7 years. Hastings nearly wept with joy because he thought I'd just doomed French industry to be a captive dumping ground for British goods. What he didn't hear was the real sentence underneath. 7 years of shelter, plus the technology in my head, would let French industry surpass Britain, and then I'd flood his low-tariff market with it. I also won lower British tariffs on French spirits and luxury goods, which is to say, on my own companies. Hastings left dreaming of becoming prime minister, having entirely forgotten to make me sign his shipbuilding treaty. On the stage behind us, an actor cried, 30 years the Seine runs east, and the whole audience wept, and I thought, yes, exactly, give it 30 years. Now I had the story. What I still needed was the court, because the tax bill lived or died in the High Court, and the High Court was Vendôme's last fortress. Owning it meant breaking 2 things. The aristocracy that hid behind it, and one specific judge. First, the aristocracy, and here's where I met the man who'd give my reforms their spine. Count La Rochefoucauld, leader of the newly rich capitalist nobles, and a giant in every sense. I caught him at a paper mill, and I told him the truth that would run through everything I did from then on. The old aristocracy, whose wealth was land and rent, and the new aristocracy, whose wealth was industry and trade, were natural enemies, and if they ever overthrew the king together, they would immediately turn and slaughter each other, which, I happen to know, is precisely what they do. Only the crown could give the capitalists what they actually needed to get rich: a Companies Act, a patent law, contract, and financial law. The old nobles had used him on this bill. The land tax barely grazed his 40 acres against Vendôme 5,000 hectares. And then I showed him the future: paper made from wood pulp, at a seventh the cost, a market worth tens of millions across Europe, and offered his group the company, me, at 20% for the technology. La Rochefoucauld walked in a capitalist noble and walked out an evangelist for industrialization, and his salon of moneymen became the raw material of my future government. The deal closed with Lomini, the Companies Act, the Patent Act, lower stamp duty, the reopened trade talks, and in exchange, the capitalist bloc's judges stopped blocking my tax bill. Divide the enemy and buy the useful half. That's the whole trick. I just had more to offer than the other side did, than the specific judge. Chief Justice Montaigne, a careful, lifelong criminal in a magistrate's robe, the single obstruction the whole bill now hung on. Tallard had mountains of dirt on him and not one usable proof, because the man was a lawyer and never wrote anything down. So my insight was simple: if the evidence doesn't exist, make him write it himself. He was currently presiding over a murder case, a vicious robbery killing of the witnesses to another crime, and he'd been bribed to bury it. So we built him a trap out of that bribe. My agent posed as a long-lost relative of the killer's desperate father, offering to buy the acquittal through connections, and produced a forged letter from Montaigne's close friend vouching for the relative as trustworthy. Montaigne took the 40,000 livre bribe, and to verify the friend's letter, he sent his valet to the town of Caen, where my intelligence division had built an entire fake Caen, planted shopkeepers giving directions, a fake villa, and a male spy in a dress serving the tea. The valet came back, confirmed. Convinced he was safe, the careful Chief Justice finally did the one thing he'd never done in a lifetime of crime. He put it in writing, and a copy of that writing was already in our hands because the maid who'd helped his friend had of course been ours. The trap sprang in open court, and I wish you could have been there for it. Montaigne, comfortable and corrupt and certain he'd covered every track, banged his gavel and acquitted the killer. And in the gallery, the young lawyer representing the murdered witness's family stood up. A huge man, ugly and magnificent, with a voice that came up from the floorboards. Victor Catherine Hugo. Which meant that in that single instant I had completed the set. Camille, Saint-Just, and now Hugo, the entire future engine of the revolution. The three men who in another life would drown France in blood. All three working for me, and every one of them convinced it was his own righteous idea. Hugo didn't argue the verdict. He simply held up a stack of letters and began to read them aloud. Montaigne's own letters, in Montaigne's own hand, arranging the bribe, naming the price, ordering the evidence buried. The color went out of the Chief Justice's face. "Where did you?" he started, and then he understood he was being destroyed in public by his own words, and he came up out of his chair and lunged bodily across the bench to snatch the papers, and Hugo just leaned back out of reach, still reading, louder now, over the judge's shoulder, to the room. And then he threw open the great doors, and behind them was the crowd Camille and Saint-Just had spent all morning gathering, and the crowd heard the words: "The Chief Justice took the money," and the sound they made is the sound this whole country would eventually be famous for. That night Montaigne ran, disguised as his own coachman. The mob caught him at the city gate and beat him half to death, and my police arrived just in time to rescue him, which we had timed to the minute because a dead judge is useless and a living one can be tried in the sunlight with his own letters read back to him, which is exactly what we did. The forgeries and the father's confession buried him, 50 years, and a full re-examination of every verdict he'd ever handed down, and the crowd I'd seated roared for the reborn court to be given real power, which had been the entire point from the beginning. Montaigne went to the block. Camille, who had wanted a hanging, sulked for a week that a simple beheading was letting the man off easy. I have never met anyone harder to satisfy on the subject of other people's deaths, and I would spend the next several years making very sure he stayed pointed away from mine. With him gone, the 5 remaining judges, staring down retrial of all their own filthy cases, one of them bought off with the vacant Chief Justice seat, voted 4-1 to register the bill. After a year of war, the tax on the aristocracy passed. The centuries-old balance between crown and nobility tipped for the first time toward the crown. We followed it immediately with a royal Supreme Court to supervise the High Court and strip its power to censor the news. And then a thing happened that had never once happened in this life. The streets of Paris cheered for the king. Long live the king, long live the Supreme Court. I stood at a window and listened to a city that 6 months earlier would have watched this family die without blinking, and I let myself feel it for about a minute before I got back to work. Because I'd cleaned out Vendôme faction, his justice minister dismissed, his foreign minister maneuvered into irrelevance, his press monopoly cracked, his court taken, and I'd bought myself something more precious than a tax. I'd bought France a monarchy the people didn't want to murder yet. Yet. The window on that yet was closing fast, and its name was hunger. Here's the doomsday clock I was actually racing. 20 million people. A harvest coming in about 30% short. a famine that would open in July and grind on into 1790, and I had roughly 6.5 months. I couldn't buy my way out. France was $2 billion in debt, and even if I sold Paris Angels whole, it'd raise $10 million, and I'd need 200 Paris Angels to feed the country. There was only one real fix, and it was the same fix as everything else: industrialize or die in the square, which meant I needed control of industrial policy, and industrial policy lived inside Valois' interior ministry, so I bought it from him at a ball, the way I bought everything, by giving a man something shiny for the thing that was actually valuable. He got the new press and publication bureau, the patent office, and a printing workshop he thought was a gift. I got jurisdiction over all industry, and quietly, control of every pamphlet printed in Paris. He thanked me twice. Then I had to get 20 million superstitious people to eat a vegetable they were certain was cursed. The famine answer, the real one, grew underground where hail couldn't kill it: the potato. 4 to 6 times the yield of wheat, the thing that let Prussia and Austria shrug off famines that gutted France, and the French wouldn't touch it. They called it the ghost apple, the devil's root. They were sure it caused leprosy, and the only people who ate it were nobles doing it as a fashionable stunt because the queen wore its flowers in her hair. So I ran a propaganda campaign for a tuber. I had the royal chefs set up on street corners frying free spiral potato towers, and only the starving children were brave enough to try them, and the children loved them, and children are the most effective marketing department God ever built. I commissioned a new serial, Popeye, about an adventurer who eats potatoes and becomes superhumanly strong because if a web novel could sell tax reform, it could sell a root vegetable. And to bless the whole thing with heaven's authority, I schemed to commission a religious oil painting, A Last Supper with potatoes on the table, which required the Archbishop's approval, which is a sentence that tells you everything about how this century solved its problems. Meanwhile, the honest scientist Cuvier wrote Loménie a drought warning report. He wouldn't lie, but he'd hedge with a certain probability, which he considered rigor, and I considered leverage, and when Loménie's first instinct was to reach for 20,000 troops to crush the coming bread riots the way Normandy always got crushed, I steered him to potatoes instead. 5 million livres to buy seed from the northeast and hand it free to farmers, repaid 2/3 after harvest, the church helping. 1 million from the government, 4 million from me, against my mortgaged mills and shares, because saving 20 million people is, it turns out, an expense you eat personally when the treasury is a smoking crater. The other half of surviving was making things people would buy, and the first patient was Lion. Lion's silk and textile industry was collapsing under cheap British cloth. 1 million livres of stock piled up, 100 workshops shuttered, 3,000 people out of work, and I was standing in the vast empty Tuileries Palace when the whole thing assembled itself in my head. Paris Fashion Week. Take the sleepy old biannual court show and turn it into a mega event. Rent 700 rooms as shops and hotel rooms, build a 50-meter catwalk, run shows every 3 hours, dump Lion's entire inventory, pull tourists and their money from across Europe, and put the Queen herself on it as the spokesperson. A Queen's Choice endorsement was worth hundreds of thousands of livres to whoever earned it. I had to personally teach a room of bewildered Parisians how to walk a runway, a demonstration I performed to my own eternal mortification and then handed off to Captain Rochefort, who had thighs for it. Model and runway became the hottest words in the city. And underneath the glamour, I ran the boring machinery that actually saves a country. 3 trusted men as grain-buying white gloves, purchasing quietly in small batches over 6 months so as not to spike the price. Tens of millions of livres of hidden reserves stacking up against July. I even had Lance build Paris its first public toilets and street trash bins under a Beautiful Paris campaign, because you cannot host the fashion capital of Europe in a city where the streets are a latrine, and because a country that can't manage its own sewage has no business lecturing anyone about its glorious future. The deepest work, though, happened in a temperature-controlled lab and on a muddy road, and those two are where I'll leave the first act of my reforms, because they're the two that mattered most. In the lab, I dictated penicillin to Cuvier. I called it a type 1 antibiotic. Grow the green mold, culture the sickness from a pneumonia patient's own sputum, filter and extract, and to make him understand why any of it would work, I had to hand him germ theory whole, the idea that invisible living things cause disease, which detonated 2,000 years of miasma and bad humors in a single afternoon. He looked like a man who'd been told the ground was made of smaller ground. It would be brutally hard, years maybe, a voyage into the dark with no map. But a drug that sends infected soldiers back to the front instead of into the grave is not a medicine, it's an army, and I told him so. And on the road to Bordeaux, I finally met the France I was actually saving. Elise rode with me. She'd relocated to Paris to study blood circulation, which was true, and to be near me, which was also true, and neither of us said the second part. I taught her germ theory and the double-blind experiment, the machine for proving that bloodletting does nothing, and she absorbed it like dry ground takes rain. Then the rain came for real, flooded the road, and we sheltered in a farmer's hovel, and I stopped being a strategist for an hour and just looked. 27 acres, 200 livres a year, and out of that, rent, and then the poll tax, the military tax, the tithe, the road tax, the mill tax, the salt tax, a dozen hands in the same thin pocket, plus a 50 livre debt at 15% that would never, ever be paid off. A fifth of the village was starving. The farmer wouldn't plant potatoes because his landlord forbade it. I made the local official cough up the road corvée the village had already paid for, and on my way out, I left the farmer 50 livres in secret, enough to clear the debt that was slowly eating his family, and I did not make a single joke about any of it because there was nothing funny in that room. I had been treating France like a chessboard. That hovel was the board looking back at me. I got in the carriage and I made myself a promise that wasn't strategic at all. I was going to break the thing that ground these people to nothing, the feudal privilege, the whole rotten scaffold of it, not because it was in my way. Because I'd seen the man it was standing on, the vineyard nobles of Bordeaux, 60% of French winemaking, decided to make me beg for potatoes, refusing to plant them as a united front, holding out for a land tax cut. So I refused to give them the thing they didn't know I had, and made them ask me for it instead. That thing was pasteurization. I stood up a winemaking technology association and demonstrated it myself. Heat the juice to 60-odd degrees for half an hour, kill the bacteria that sour the wine, and watch your failure rate drop to nothing and your price jump tenfold. 8 days later, 12 barrels, 0 spoiled, no acidity, the nobles nearly weeping with joy, and my terms were 3% per barrel, and one small thing. Membership meant loyalty to the king, and loyalty to the king meant planting potatoes. The land tax alliance evaporated in an afternoon. The holdouts who'd skipped the meeting were locked out and crawled back to plant 2/3 of their land at double the fee. I picked up a genuine Girondin orator named Roland along the way, betting him into my service, and I spent one clean day on a beach at Arcachon eating garlic oysters with Elise while the future burned quietly on schedule behind us. It was the closest thing to a vacation I'd get. The oysters were excellent. I named them after myself. A prince has to have some vices. The industrial machine, meanwhile, I built out of stolen British genius, and I mean stolen as the highest compliment I can pay my own recruiting. I couldn't have George Stephenson. The great man wouldn't leave Birmingham for any money, but I got something better and didn't know it until he arrived. Stevenson's assistant, a Scot named David Stevenson, overheard my agent making a million-livre offer to build France a steam engine industry, and he followed that offer to Paris and knocked on my door and said essentially, I can do everything Stevenson can, I invented half of what he took credit for, and he keeps burying my ideas. Which was true. Stevenson had personally invented the planetary gear Stevenson patented, the high-pressure engine Stevenson was too conservative to build, and the gas lamp Stevenson never even dreamed of. I made him general manager of France Royal Machinery and set him to build precision machine tools first, the mother machines that make all the other machines, and I told him to quietly write to his old friends on Stevenson's bench and let them know France paid better. Over the following year, I stripped the Birmingham workshop of its best minds, one polite letter at a time. Then there was Pasteur, the father of modern chemistry, the man who named oxygen, whom I needed to make the fulminate for my percussion caps. I visited him in his laboratory, and as a thank you gift, I handed him something I'd been carrying around in my head like contraband, alphabet symbols for the elements, not the alchemist's little suns and moons and crossed sickles, letters. You call this one carbon, I said, writing on his slate. So, C, oxygen, O, and when they combine, 2 oxygen to 1 carbon, I wrote CO2. You can simply say it, write it. A whole language out of letters and small numbers. Pasteur stared at the slate for a long, long moment. Then he pulled it out of my hands, not rudely, the way a starving man takes bread, and he started writing equations, faster and faster, his own reactions, decades of muddled alchemical notation collapsing into clean lines in front of him. This is, he said, and didn't finish, and I don't think he needed to. He put it in his textbook, the one that would teach the whole world chemistry. And then I did the ungrateful thing, which was to warn him, quit the tax farming gene. Get out of it before the reforms come. Because in the history I remembered, it wasn't chemistry that killed Pasteur. It was tax farming and a revolutionary tribunal that decided the Republic had no need of scientists, and I would have set fire to a great many of my own plans to keep that particular head attached to that particular neck. And under Pasteur, I funded a standards committee that would, in a hall at the Sorbonne, unveil to a scrambling Europe the metric system, the meter, defined as 1/10,000,000th of the distance from the pole to the equator, the kilogram, a block of platinum, a single rational set of measures to replace the 800 different regional units France used to cheat each other with. I was standardizing an entire civilization in the same season I was keeping it from starving to death. Both of those mattered. Only one of them made the newspapers. But the prettiest piece of work in this whole stretch was the trap I sprang on a traitor named Polignac, and it's the one I'd show you if I could only show you one. Polignac commanded the French Guard. He was Vendôme man, and in the history, I knew he'd help fire the cannons at the Bastille. His humiliated officers ran a false flag on me. During my academy's artillery training, they fired an extra cannon into a nearby farmhouse, killing an old couple to frame my reckless police as a danger to the public. My gunners caught it. 4 shots for 3 training cannons, but proof was another matter, so I did what I do. I framed them back, harder, and I built it around a fake attempt on my own life. I welcomed a visiting princess along a route the French Guard locked down, and I smuggled my own men into a farmhouse on that route disguised as court painters, right past Polignac's checkpoints. The morning of, my agent fired a British musket and a French rifle at my empty carriage as a signal, then eliminated the 2 coerced criminals I'd staged as the assassins. The guard panicked and fired wildly. And inside the carriage, Khalil and I calmly peeled the wax off pre-drilled bullet holes, embedded a lead ball in the woodwork, and Khalil nicked my arm and drowned it in chicken blood while shouting, "Oh God, the prince has been shot!" Polignac nearly fell off his horse. My mother fainted and then flew to me. 12 layers of bandage over what was, medically speaking, a chicken. Khalil and I traded a small thumbs up on our performance while I moaned convincingly, and when the dust settled, a British ball, dead perpetrators who couldn't talk, and no possible explanation for how they'd slipped past 3,000 guardsmen, except that Polignac was catastrophically negligent or worse, dismissed. Exiled to the Seychelles, which for a French nobleman was a death sentence with better weather, his officers confined, and the loyalist Flanders Brigade brought in to replace the Guard as the Paris garrison. I had just removed the men who would have shelled the Bastille, and I'd done it by getting shot with a chicken. The Polignac crisis also handed me the thing I wanted most in the world, which was an army of my own, legally. I sent Murat to the drowning war minister with an offer. "I'll calm this whole disaster for you, scapegoat the guilty, spare the innocent officers through my merciful influence, and in exchange, give me 1 elite legion I get to staff myself." The war minister, buried in protests, said yes. So I sent Murat back to also plant Ney as a cavalry commander and strip every horse and gun and supply he could carry, and I built it. 1,700 hand-picked men, every purchased and noble and criminal officer purged, nobody above captain, promotion by merit alone, pay handed directly into each man's hand by pay officers so no one could skim it, and a raise on top. I reviewed 2,200 men on the Mars ground who would, when the world burned, look at me and not at any duke. The Crown Prince's Guard Legion, and when they scrimmaged my police academy cadets and only managed a draw, the cadets crushing them on the cross-country march and formation drills because I'd been secretly training the police as an army the whole time. The elite legion humbly asked to come train at the academy too, partly for the tactics, mostly, I suspect, for the food. I did not skimp on the food. An army marches on its stomach, and mine marched on beef stew and white bread, and the certainty that their prince fed them better than their old colonels ever had. Now, the debt. 2 billion livres, 200 million a year in interest, bleeding toward 400 million, and next to it, the tax farmers skimming a fifth of everything they collected. 2 wounds that would kill France before any famine did. And I remember staring at the books and thinking, idly, dangerously, wouldn't it be lovely if every bank that had loaned the government money simply went bankrupt? File that thought. It grows up later. But first I had to build the outside of the machine, because you cannot fix France from inside France alone. So I sent Richelieu, the great survivor, the diplomat who'd outlive everyone in this story, including probably me, out into the world with a plan disguised as charity. We would attack the Barbary pirates. Nobody in Europe could object to fighting pirates. The Americans alone were paying millions in ransom to them. And when the smoke cleared, the pirates' North African bases, nominally Ottoman, would happen to become ours, with the United States and Spain and Russia all quietly backing us, so Britain couldn't say a word. Richelieu went to Philadelphia and pitched it to Monroe and Adams. Adams saw straight through it, of course. The old fox knew France wanted North Africa, but he took the deal anyway because it was still good for America. And then Richelieu recruited Burr by framing buy warships, fight pirates as the way to strengthen the weak federal government, which Burr wanted more than air. The United States traded me cotton for 3 frigates. Cotton for my textile mills, warships for my North African adventure, and Richelieu pocketed a $4,000 kickback on the side, which I let him keep, because a diplomat who steals a little is a diplomat who's paying attention. He shipped 15,000 of France's old muskets onto Russia as a gift, and Anastasia paid the freight and thanked us with grain. Every piece moved 3 other pieces. I was playing 3-dimensional chess with men who thought they were playing checkers and winning, and the worst part is how much I enjoyed it. At home, my father finished the percussion cap musket, and I want to tell you about the day he proved it because it's one of my favorite memories in either life. I'd handed him the idea months earlier, a copper cap of mercury fulminate that explodes when the hammer strikes it, so you never have to prime a pan, which means 3 fewer steps to load, more power, and a gun that works in the rain. To me, it was a memory from a textbook. To my father, the master lockmaker, it was the most beautiful mechanical problem anyone had ever given him, and he'd solved it, and now he wanted to show me. So at the academy range, he stood next to Leclerc, a grizzled veteran, one of the fastest hands with a flintlock in France, and proposed a race. The old soldier with the old gun against the king with the new one. Load and fire, most rounds in a minute. The instructors gathered to watch their king, whom half of them privately considered a harmless eccentric, embarrass himself against a professional. Leclerc's hands were a blur. Prime, pour, ram, cock, fire. The practiced music of 30 years, and my father, who had never been a soldier a day in his life, kept pace, because his gun had thrown away the 3 slowest steps, and all he had to do was drop a cap and a ball and fire, and his careful lockmaker's hands did it smoothly, calmly, again and again, and when the minute ended, he was only a shot or 2 behind a man who'd been doing this since before I was born, with a fraction of the training and none of the smoke blowing back in his face. There was a silence. Then the instructors started shouting, the way soldiers shout when they've just seen the future and it's pointed down range. My father looked at the smoking musket in his hands, and then he looked at me, and his whole face was the face of a man who has spent his entire life being gently laughed at for loving locks, and has just discovered that the thing he loved was the most dangerous skill in the kingdom all along. We named it the Auguste 1788 after his own name, Antoine Auguste, and I made certain every newspaper in France credited the king, personally, as the man who'd armed his country with the future. His prestige climbed like a rocket. Mine stayed exactly where I kept it, in the dark behind the curtain, which is the only place a puppeteer can actually work. And then Fashion Week detonated, and I got very, very rich, and I met a Russian. 100,000 visitors poured into Paris. The Queen opened it with fireworks. I'd built a 50-meter runway and taught Parisians to walk it like they owned the planet. Models, price boards, pre-sale staff, an entire modern spectacle Europe had never imagined and immediately began stealing. But the runway was only the front door. Behind it, I'd assembled the whole beautiful machine for separating people from their silver and making them thank me while it happened. A royal restaurant serving my garlic oysters, a horse tram gliding on wooden rails, villas with their own schools and hospitals, the Eden amusement park with a steam-powered Ferris wheel and a haunted house, and my proudest sin, an arcade. The arcade was rows of slot machines and pinball tables, built by out-of-work watchmakers out of springs and gears, and it ate silver the way the ocean eats rivers. I'd forgotten, honestly, how completely the 18th century had no defenses against a slot machine because they'd never seen one, and a person who has never developed an immunity to a flashing light that occasionally pays out is a person who will stand there feeding it coins until dawn, which is exactly what one man did. A Russian count, in a good coat, playing 4 machines at once methodically with the 1,000-yard stare of a true believer, still going at 3 in the morning while the staff swept up around his feet. I went over and sat down next to him, because a man that rich and that bored is a resource. "They're rigged, you know," I told him pleasantly. "Slightly, in the house's favor. Over a long enough night, the machine always wins." "Of course it does," he said, not looking up, pulling the lever. "So does everything. At least this one is honest about it." I liked him immediately. I told him a small parable about a man who owned the casino instead of playing it, and I watched the idea land, and by the time the sun came up, I'd pried the great Count Dmitri off the slot machines and into a business sauce because this bored playboy turned out to be Dmitri, Anastasia the Great's own illegitimate son, wandering Europe pretending to be harmless to keep himself clear of the succession knives at home. We founded a France-Russia trading company that would sail under the Russian flag, where the British Navy couldn't lay a finger on it, selling French wine and paper into a market of 30 million Russians and buying back Russian flax. And the flax was the quiet knife because 80% of Britain's flax came from Russia too, and every bale I bought was a bale Britain now had to outbid me for. I made a friend, opened a market, and raised my rival's costs, all before breakfast, off a man who couldn't stop pulling a lever. 6 days of Fashion Week cleared 4.5 million livres against 300,000 in cost. I repaid the government's debt to me, and I bought grain with the rest. And somewhere in the middle of it, a diamond necklace went to auction, and 2 women bid it up to 650,000 livres in a duel that was very obviously about me, and not at all about the necklace. One of them secretly bankrolled by my own mother to make sure she won. Which is a whole romantic subplot I genuinely do not have the emotional budget to unpack here, except to say, I am 15 years old, every royal house in Europe wants a piece of me, and unlike everyone else at that auction, I have read a book about genetics. Which brings me back to the debt, and to Turgot, and to the most satisfying financial murder I ever committed without touching anyone. Turgot was the celebrated banker whose high-interest loans had started France's whole death spiral, steering the first loans to his own Swiss bank, skimming a percent off $1 billion borrowed over 7 years. I aimed my future Jacobin attack dogs at him, and when his people started killing witnesses to bury the trail, they nearly killed Camille, actually, knifed him in Lorraine, and he was saved by a young woman named Charlotte Corday, which is a name that will mean something horrible to you later if you know your history. I broke his exiled rival Mazarin instead. Mazarin, facing a murder charge, confessed his own embezzlement for a pardon, and then handed me the real prize. More than half of the billion livres Turgot had arranged France to borrow was irregular, fraudulent, which meant I could re-examine 500 million livres of national debt, suspend the interest, renegotiate it, or simply void it. Turgot ran, so I surrounded 3 sides and left one open, the oldest trick there is. I blocked every escape route, pardoned him publicly and gently, and then planted an escalating bounty on his head, blamed on the very bankers who'd protected him until his only safe path in all of France led straight to the crown, and he turned himself in out of a sewer. Vendôme and the bankers tried to poison him in the Bastille. Tallard had already swapped in a death row decoy, so the decoy died, and the real Turgot sat safe in a farmhouse while the poisoner met a quiet end. Then Vendôme played his last card, and it was a good one. Force the fraudulent banks to declare bankruptcy, which under a France with no bankruptcy law would legally void their government loans, but would also wipe out every ordinary saver and noble investor at once, plunging the country into terror, and force the crown to stop Turgot's trial to stop the panic. I watched a woman weep over 80 lost livres, and I understood the trap. The debt had to evaporate slowly, not die all at once. So I built the thing that solved everything. The France Industrial Development Fund. A debt-to-equity swap. Investors converted their doomed bank money into shares of France's industrial future, transparent, committee-run, losses refunded, locked in 5 years. While the Bank of France acquired the bankrupt banks at 0 cost, their fines becoming its equity, the bank run diffused itself. People would rather earn interest than burn the country down. Turgot was convicted, fined into oblivion, exiled, and then killed anyway by the bankers he'd have exposed, because I'd pardoned him, but I couldn't protect a man that many people needed dead. And the 7 surviving banks looked at the smoking crater where their industry used to be and surrendered on my terms. Cut government interest to 3%, hand over 30% equity as a fine, and accept nationally unified banknotes. In the span of a few months, the Bank of France became France's central bank. The debt went from a death sentence to a manageable ache, and I decorated Camille and his terror machine and promoted them to a cabinet-level fair investigations bureau, where they could keep gnawing on corrupt nobles and thinking they served the people instead of me. They tried to resign once, actually, refused to serve filthy nobles. And I out-argued them on Rousseau until Camille took it back and said he hoped to see a better France. He would. He just wouldn't like how. And then July came, and July was the whole reason I'd done any of it. The drought hit first, brutal, biblical, streams drying to cracked mud, fields going gray, and the Bordeaux vineyards stayed green anyway because a 15-horsepower steam engine bought on an agricultural loan was pumping the Garonne over them while the neighbors watched their vines die. Steam pumps saved crops across France that summer, and one clever governor ordered wooden sheds built over every pump and water wheel and windmill in his province, which I mention only because it saved his province, because the hail came next. The historical hailstorm, the real one. The 40 minutes of fist-sized ice that in the timeline I remembered flattened the wheat of France and put the last nail in the coffin the revolution climbed out of. It came exactly on schedule. It shredded the standing wheat like the sky was settling a grudge. And this time, nothing happened. Nothing. The potatoes were underground where hail can't reach them. The grain reserves were stacked in depots I'd been quietly filling for 6 months. The steam pumps lived under their sheds. And the relief machine I'd built switched on the way I'd designed it. Bread loans at 4 livres a month through the parish banks, free potato seed at no interest, government-funded disaster relief, which was a thing that simply did not exist in 1788. 4 million livres a month flowing out through the banks to the farmers, paid in the new banknotes, which quietly rolled out the whole currency while it fed people. I went and looked once because I needed to see it with my own eyes. The farmer with the 27 acres, the one whose debt I'd cleared in secret on a rainy night, his family was fine, thin, tired, but fine, standing in a field of green potato tops while the wheat lay ruined all around them, and they were going to eat that winter. Down the road, a family that would have starved in the other timeline was carrying home bread bought on a 4-livre loan. I stood at the edge of that field, and I did not make a joke because there wasn't one. The disaster that killed the monarchy and the history I came from had just happened, right on time, and France had shrugged it off like a man shrugging off rain, and nobody in that field knew that the sky had just tried to end them and missed. Nobody would ever know. That's the thing about prevention. You save 20 million people, and the only reward is that nothing happens and no one notices. I noticed. It was enough. It had to be. The rest of that season I ran on pure momentum because for one strange stretch the machine I'd built was finally bigger than the crises trying to knock it over. There was fertilizer, of all things. I'd handed my traders the coordinates to a speck of a Pacific island called Nauru, and their ships came back low in the water with phosphate, mountains of ancient bird droppings that would make French soil produce like it never had in its life. There was the king's birthday, which I refused to cancel despite the famine and instead rebuilt into an enormous relief festival. Free food every day, a lottery, singing contest judged by the queen, sword contest judged by the king, 300,000 livres spent to give a frightened, hungry Paris something to cheer about instead of something to burn. There was the first squadron of Barbary pirates, blown out of the water off Minorca by my joint fleet of French and American and Dutch ships, the opening blow of a campaign that would eventually hand me a province. And there were the account books, which for the first time in living memory were staggering toward balance, the debt down 130 million livres, the interest cut in half, while across town, the Duke of Vendôme sat and watched a boy accomplish on the ledger what his whole scheming life had failed to do, his last front collapsing under him. I made La Rochefoucauld the first minister of industry. I ate a proper dinner for once. It was briefly, almost easy, which, if you've been paying any attention at all to how my life works, is the precise and reliable sound of the whole board about to tilt underneath me. The board tilted toward North Africa, and specifically toward Tunisia, and the game I played there was the ugliest and cleverest thing I did in this whole life. I needed Tunisia, fertile, portful, 3 wheat harvests a year, close enough to feed France and resettle her starving poor. And it was held by the Janissaries, an inbred foreign warrior caste sitting on all the wealth with not a single local friend. You don't take a place like that with an army. You take it by making everyone who lives there want the current owners dead and then handing them the matches. It started with a pirate. A pretender named Hassan was rotting in an Algiers prison, and his daughter Zoya, a fierce, scarred woman who captained her own ship, came to me to bargain for his freedom, and she came the way pirates come, with a chest of jewelry and a column of enslaved Europeans as gifts. I took the deal and refused the slaves. I'd buy their freedom, not accept them as tribute. Spring Hassan, arm his rebellion, 2 million livres on proof of troops in exchange for the end of Tunisian piracy and the port of Bizerte. Zoya thought she'd bought a patron. She'd bought an executioner with a schedule. Because I didn't trust Hassan 1 inch. He was a man who'd betrayed his own father for a throne, and he was the secret money behind the very pirates I was busy hunting, and I had no intention of ever letting him actually win. I meant to use him up and throw him away, and I told my own consul as much privately, so he'd stop looking so hopeful. Then I armed the other side too. Through the sitting bey's own favorite concubine, who was, of course, secretly mine, I tipped the bey off to Hassan's coming rebellion so he'd march out and crush it, and I deliberately, quietly, let Hassan's promised weapons be delayed by a storm so that when the two forces met, Hassan would be outnumbered and outgunned and would bleed. I set the pretender and the tyrant on each other and starved them both just enough to make it slow, because a long fight between your two enemies is worth more than a quick win for either. And while they exhausted the Janissaries' strength grinding on each other, my actual endgame sat quietly in the wings the whole time. A palace coup by the bey's dispossessed nephew Omar, and that same concubine, waiting for the moment both armies were too tired to matter. Hassan thought I was his patron. The bey thought I was a distant nuisance. Zoya thought she'd hired me. Every single person on that board believed I was working for them. I was working for none of them. I was the boy standing off to the side, holding the box of matches, deciding which of them to light and in what order. Then, when the factions had bled each other soft, I sent in the actual army. Murat's crown prince's guard came off the fleet at the pirate stronghold of Bizerte in a landing so disciplined the pirates on the walls thought at first they were watching a parade. The guard formed on the beach under fire without a man breaking stride, walked their percussion cap volleys up the slope faster than the defenders could reload their ancient muskets, 3 of my rounds for every one of theirs, and dropped mortar shells over the walls with a precision this coast had never seen. Young Ney led the academy cadets up a scaling breach and into the fort, and he was magnificent, and he was also visibly, furiously jealous that the cadets he thought of as schoolboys had gotten to the top of the wall before his own cavalry could dismount. 48 minutes. That's how long the greatest pirate fortress on the Barbary coast lasted against soldiers I trained in a police academy. The pirate captain who terrorized the Mediterranean for a decade surrendered to a 19-year-old with a bayonet. Then Murat did something that looked like a mistake and wasn't. He stopped, rested a day and a half. Let the survivors flee east, toward Tunis, toward the real prize, because a broken enemy running to the exact place you want him is not a problem, it's delivery. And in Tunis, my agent, the Bey's own favorite, whispered the doomed man into his grave. She counseled him, sweetly, patiently, fatally, to defend the pirate navy and defy France, and he listened to her because men in love are the easiest marks on earth, and that sealed him. As Murat's guards smashed his army against the walls from outside, the nephew, Omar, the boy this Bey had robbed of a throne and a beloved both, came over the palace wall with a knife and a handful of my agents dressed as tailors, and he settled his own account. One stroke. Personal. I'll spare you the room. And Omar stood up over what he'd done as the new Bey of Tunis, my Bey, and disbanded the pirate navy, and handed me every corsair on the coast, and my agent stood at his shoulder, finally, having married the man she'd waited a war for. Everyone in that palace got exactly what they'd wanted. I'd made sure of it. That's how you own people, not by taking what they want, but by being the one who hands it to them. And when the news reached Europe, the Barbary pirates broken, 33,000 enslaved Christians freed, 100,000 more protected, the Pope himself declared my father, Henri XVII, the lockmaker, the savior of suffering. Nobles stampeded to buy hyper-fertile Tunisian land. My mother threw a ball with her hair styled like our flagship, long live the savior of suffering. And nobody in that cheering palace knew that the whole beautiful crusade had been a real estate acquisition run on the corpses of men I deliberately set against each other. I knew. I was getting very used to knowing things alone. Taking Tunisia was the easy part. Keeping it is where Britain came in, because Britain is a professional at exactly one thing, and that thing is making sure nobody else gets to have anything nice. Their consul started bribing the leftover Janissary officers and the Berber tribes to burn my new factories and raid my caravans, telling the farmers, with a straight face, that French agriculture would steal the life force from the land, which is the exact playbook they'd used to bleed themselves during the American Revolution, now aimed at me. Attacks flared everywhere. My puppet Bey couldn't stop them, and back in Paris the vultures circled. Vendôme, quietly bribed by the British ambassador, and Valois pushed to abandon Tunisia entirely, while the military aristocracy wanted a 10 million livre war, mostly because a war would let them swallow Murat's legion back into the noble-run army, which was the thing they feared most, a crown with its own soldiers. I refused both. No war, no retreat. A few 100,000 livres and persuasion. The Queen said persuade first, and I sailed for Tunisia to do the persuading personally, having promised her I'd stay safely aboard my ship, a promise I honored, technically, by having a boat mounted on top of a carriage and riding around inside it. Wordplay is a load-bearing part of my foreign policy. Here was the actual plan, and it's the one I'm least proud of and most impressed by, which is a combination I'd gotten uncomfortably familiar with. The Janissaries were a tiny foreign minority with all the money and no local roots. So I wasn't going to fight them. I was going to make the entire population want them dead, and I was going to do it with identity and God. First, identity. I had historians fabricate a scholarly treatise proving that Tunisians and Frenchmen were both children of Rome, long-lost Roman brothers, oppressed by the foreign Ottoman, and I printed it in Arabic and Berber on a press I'd brought along, published under a local scholar's name for 1,000 rial, and the intellectual class ate it whole, because everyone, everywhere, in every century, would rather be the heir of a glorious empire than the subject of a tired one. Then, when a cautious old religious elder refused to bless a revolt, I had the Queen's court painters forge an enormous oil painting of him declaring holy war on the Ottomans, spread it across the country, and left the poor man under martial law unable to deny a picture. The Last Supper trick, again, it just works. But the people were still afraid, so I manufactured miracles, and I want to be honest that this is the part where I fully understood I'd become a supervillain. I had acid-etched oracle stones hidden inside the bellies of fish along the Majerta River so that fishermen kept cutting open their catch and finding the word of God telling them to drive out the Ottoman. I had ventriloquists hidden in the reeds making foxes appear to cry out prophecies at night, and then, for the finale, on the holy day of Ashura, I had a sculptor blast a 4-meter one-eyed stone giant out of rock in 8 days and discover it in the river, fulfilling a prophecy I had also planted. Tens of thousands of people fell to their knees and worshipped a statue I'd commissioned on a deadline. The natives finally believed God was on their side. God, as far as I could tell, had no comment, but my sculptor did excellent work. After that, the actual uprising ran itself. The first native assault on a Janissary garrison faltered under cannon fire until my hidden academy artillery blasted a breach, which everyone promptly understood as divine punishment, and then the mob poured in, looted 30,000 rial, and learned the intoxicating lesson that the Janissaries could bleed. Greed and courage caught like fire. The attacks on my Frenchmen stopped because now we were all Roman brothers. 20,000 rebels elected their leader, who was hilariously my own agent Elias, now Elian Pasha. and besieged Tunis, and when they needed artillery, my French officers and 6 guns quietly joined and got themselves worshipped as war gods while maneuvering a mob to victory. The Janissaries surrendered. Tunis fell. And when the rebels moved to execute my puppet bey as an Ottoman, my consul saved him with a genealogy. A bey is a Tunisian ruler, not a janissary. Look, he even had a Genoese grandmother, and the terrified man swore on the spot that he was a glorious descendant of Rome, and the mob that had come to kill him bowed to him instead. I kept my cooperative figurehead. Tunisia became not a colony, but a province of France, because colonies are far away, and far away things break free, and Tunisia was 3 days from Corsica and would never ever be allowed to. It should have been the top of the mountain. I'd fed France, broken the pirates, taken a province, cracked all 3 of Vendôme pillars, and turned the men who'd murdered the monarchy in one history into the monarchy's own attack dogs in this one. I let myself feel good about it for almost a full day. That was the day the Duke of Vendôme decided to burn the country down rather than lose it to me. But before I tell you how a man tries to burn a country, I have to tell you about the army that came for Tunisia first, because that's where I found 3 ghosts. Britain, having failed to bribe my province apart, went bigger. They funded the Ottomans to send 23,000 men from Algiers to take Tunisia back. 11,000 Janissaries and 12,000 Albanian mercenaries, the toughest hired killers in the Mediterranean. Against them, I had my guard and some unreliable locals, maybe 7,000 real soldiers, and a supply situation that was frankly a joke, because a province you conquered last month does not have functioning logistics, which meant I couldn't wait and defend. I had to hit them first in their own territory before they were ready. So the guard marched 110 kilometers in 3.5 days, Napoleonic speed, the kind of marching Europe didn't think was physically possible, with my disguised cavalry scrubbing out the enemy scouts along the way, so the surprise stayed a surprise, and we fell on the Albanian vanguard while they were still strung out and half asleep on the road. I went with them. I told my mother I wouldn't, and I did, because an army fights differently when the prince is bleeding the same dust they are. I even helped drag a cannon out of an ice pit, which contributed roughly nothing in actual force. I was a 15-year-old with the upper body strength of a 15-year-old, but every man who saw me put my shoulder to that gun remembered it later on the firing line, and morale is not made of physics. And I watched Murat conduct a battle like a symphony while I took notes, because I could scheme all day, but I still had to learn how to actually win a fight, and there is no better classroom than standing behind the greatest staff officer in Europe while he takes apart 13,000 mercenaries. It was a clinic. Massed artillery concentrated on a single point. Line infantry advancing in 3-step volleys like a machine that happened to be made of men. Offensive hollow squares, the trick Alexander would use against the Mamluks, deployed years before Alexander thought of it. The Albanians broke, and 2 of my officers turned out to be ghosts from a future that hadn't happened. One was Massena, a commoner who'd rise to Duke of Danzig, holding a hilltop against 3,000 routing men with 220. The other was that boy Ney, 18 years old, leading the bayonet charge that cracked the line, the Iron Marshal in the shell of a lieutenant. We lost 89 dead, 89 against 23,000. And when I marched with those men, something changed in how they looked at me. It stopped being gratitude and started being love, which is a more dangerous and more useful thing to be given. At the medal ceremony afterward, pinning silver on a commoner who'd earned it with his body instead of his birth, I looked at Murat and Massena and Ney standing in a row, and I did the math. 3 of Alexander's marshals. I had collected 3 of Alexander's marshals, and I still hadn't found Alexander. Where are you? I thought. Where are you hiding, you short, furious, world-ending little man? I've built the army you were supposed to inherit. I've got your generals. I just need you. He was out there somewhere, 19 years old, and I would find him. But first I had to go home, because home was where the real war was about to start, and it wasn't going to be fought with cannon. The homecoming was a triumph. December of 1788, and all of Paris came out to cheer the boy who'd brought back a province, and the nobles who'd once mocked this family now fawned, and the Pope had blessed us, and for a few days it was genuinely wonderful. I brought my mother a jar of ancient Tunisian pottery, and my father a crocodile skin holster, and my little brother a parrot that swore in Arabic, and I told them my war stories over pudding while the queen finally looked at me, not as her sickly boy, but as a man who'd fought a battle and come home. I edited the stories, obviously. I left out the fake miracles and the one-eyed stone giant because my parents were devout Catholics, and I invented a pagan god to start a holy war. Does not go over well at the dinner table, and I let myself have that. A warm room, a family that was, in the timeline I came from, already 2 years dead, all of them alive and laughing and safe. I earned that pudding. Then I went back to my desk, and the top document on the pile was the food, because it's always the food. The harvest was down 27%. The grain reserves were at 18% and would last until March. The Tunisian wheat wouldn't ripen until late April. There was a gap, a hungry month-wide gap, And gaps like that are where revolutions crawl in. I'd held it off once. I could feel it pressing on the door again. And underneath the food report was a small, ugly thing that didn't look like much yet. An arson case. A minor noble named Farrell, burned to death in his own house, and 2 impoverished brothers arrested and rushed toward the guillotine with suspicious, unnatural speed. A grieving girl came to beg me to save the heroes who'd done it, and I started pulling the thread because a case that moves that fast is a case somebody is trying to bury before it can be read. The thread led to my old blackmail victim, the Interior Minister Valois, who'd used his censorship powers to smother the story and bribed a judge to fast-track the execution, all to protect his own son, who was tangled in the mess. Fine, corrupt minister protecting his idiot child, ugly but ordinary. Except it wasn't ordinary, because when Tallard finished pulling, the thread didn't end at Valois. It went one hand higher, to the hand that was always behind everything, and I sat in the candlelight with the report and understood, cold all the way down, that the Duke of Vendôme had engineered the entire thing, the arson, the brothers, the whole squalid little tragedy, not for any of the reasons on the surface. He'd built it to reach Valois, and if a man like Vendôme needed a cabinet minister that badly, then the arson wasn't the plot. The arson was just the door. The real thing was still loading, somewhere I couldn't see yet, and it was going to be the biggest thing he'd ever thrown at me, because he'd finally run out of smaller things that worked. Here's what he was actually building, and I'll give the devil his due. It was the best plan anyone ever aimed at me. Vendôme had a wound. Months back, one of my old counter-schemes had rebounded onto his son and heir, tangling the young man in a ruinous scandal that discredited the whole Vendôme line's future. And when the Duke worked out that I'd engineered it, something in him let go. He stopped playing the long game to win. He started playing to burn. He engineered the arson to trap Valois, and then he went to Valois' villa at midnight and made him an offer no cornered man refuses. I will make your son's problem disappear, and I will pay you 2 million livres, and in exchange, you will help me take the scepter. The plan was elegant and monstrous. France was 1 bad month from famine, held back only by the strategic grain reserves. So make the reserves disappear, empty the southern granaries through forged transfer orders, plunge the country into engineered starvation, and rise out of the chaos as Prince Regent, the real power, with my parents reduced to ornaments. Valois, drowning, said yes, and then he improved it, because a desperate man is a creative one. He added the frozen rivers, idling the mills, the Tunisian land my immigration policy had cheapened, every grievance the great nobles were nursing, and offered them all up as kindling. He'd be chief minister in the new order. They shook on the end of my world. And it started to work, because I'd left him one weapon I couldn't take away, my own mother's temper. Vendôme planted 2 forged denunciations of a slow, resentful general named Saint-Savin, and the queen, who already blamed the man for dawdling while I was in danger in Tunisia, fell on him with both feet, gutting his legion, docking his pay, and kicking, with perfect precision, the exact hornet's nest Vendôme needed kicked. The military aristocracy, already terrified of a crown that had its own soldiers and let commoners become officers, now had a martyr. At a secret hunt, Vendôme showed the generals a percussion-capped musket and explained my merit promotion system. A commoner could make general, no purchase, no bloodline, and told them, correctly, that I was digging up their ancestral graves. They agreed they needed a crisis the crown couldn't handle. He promised them one. Then the granaries went empty, quietly, on forged paperwork signed by an interior minister, because who questions the interior minister moving grain during a shortage? And in the south, a spy of Vendôme handed a gang leader 4 livres a man to turn hunger into riot, and it caught, and it spread. And I want to stop being clever for one paragraph and tell you what it actually looked like on the ground, because I saw the reports and I've never gotten them out of my head. It looked like a woman in a looted house trying to feed chewed breadcrumbs to a baby who was too weak to swallow, while an old man stole the last of the bread to feed his own starving grandson. And neither of them was a villain. They were just 2 people at the bottom of a hole a duke had dug for sport. That's what "make the grain reserves disappear" means when it stops being a sentence and a scheme. It means that woman and that baby. Vendôme did that on purpose, to 20 million people, to make himself regent. I have done a great many cold-blooded things in this life, and justified most of them to myself. I never once forgave him that room. I still don't. Riots bloomed across the south, Nice, Montpellier, Foix, Brittany, tens of thousands of people, and the army that should have quelled them needed 2 months to mobilize, which is army for we're letting it burn. And then, by pure dumb luck, I got my first crack in it. That vigilante idealist, Amélie, and her little brotherhood of noble kids broke into the Bastille to squeeze a confession out of the arson brothers, straight into a sting Tallard was already running, so they botched everything and got caught. But on their way to blowing my operation, they overheard the brothers name their real master, the Duke. And Amélie, who had been trying to do the right thing badly her whole life, finally did it well. She broke into Vendôme Palace, found every document gone and the safe standing open and empty, and understood in one cold flash that the Duke had fled the city with everything, which meant the thing he was doing was so big he never intended to be in Paris when it went off. She ran to me at midnight to tell me. And I looked at the empty archive report and the map of the burning South, and I finally saw the whole shape of it, all at once, the way I usually saw everything and had somehow missed this. He wasn't rioting the South for its own sake. The riots were the excuse. The generals would march to restore order, and then they wouldn't stop marching, and 80,000 men would gather into a fist around Paris, and my parents, with almost no soldiers of their own, would have no choice but to hand Vendôme the regency to make it end. He'd turned the whole country into a hostage. It was, genuinely, the best plan anyone ever aimed at me, so I aimed a better one back. The emergency cabinet was a room full of men ready to surrender. The great nobles had sent their demands through the Duke of Gramont: abolish the Supreme Court, scrap the noble taxes, repeal the Mill Act, gut the press bureau, put my legions under their command, make every royal troop movement wait for a noble's signature. 20 generals signed, the whole year of my reforms handed back at knife point. And the ministers were inclined to pay it because the army said 2 months and the riots said now. I sat there and did quiet arithmetic while they despaired, because Vendôme had made one mistake, and it was the same mistake everyone made about me. He'd counted the crowned soldiers at 13,000. He hadn't counted the police academy as an army, because who counts a police school as an army? I did. I'd built it to be one. I had close to 20,000 elite troops that Vendôme didn't know were troops, and the man who thinks he's holding all the cards against a man who has hidden an army in a schoolhouse is not, in fact, holding all the cards. But troops weren't even the answer, and I almost missed it. Over lunch, Lomini mentioned buying grain from Spain, and the whole thing flipped over in my head. The riots weren't a military problem. They were a food problem wearing a military costume. Those provinces didn't lack grain. Their grain had been stolen, and stolen grain can be replaced. Feed them for 2 weeks and the riots would evaporate on their own, no army required. And I knew exactly where a mountain of hidden grain was sitting in France because I'd read the history, the Catholic Church hoarding food in cellars across the entire country so much that when the revolution finally seized it, it fed Paris. The church was a granary that thought it was a religion. And I, a devout atheist from a future none of these bishops could imagine, had absolutely no qualms about robbing it. Better still, I suddenly saw that Vendôme chaos wasn't just a threat. It was the cover I needed to break the military aristocracy for good. He'd handed me a wildfire and I just realized I could aim it, so I stopped the cabinet from surrendering. I argued for 0 concessions, and when I looked around the table, my ministers stood up one by one to back me. Lomini, La Rochefoucauld, Sartine, the whole bench I'd spent a year building. And it shocked the queen so badly she granted me what I actually needed, which was the authority to rule by decree in her name. My first act was to fire the foreign minister on the spot, because he was Vendôme's last mole in the cabinet, and I was done being watched. My second act was to go rob God. I did it at a party. The high clergy of France held a discreet monthly gathering with certain secrets they'd rather the world not know, the kind of luxuries and hidden fortunes that sit poorly against a vow of poverty, and I got the intelligence out of Richelieu, who was himself technically an archbishop and knew exactly which cupboards the skeletons lived in. Then I crashed the gathering with a simple trick. I'd sent each bishop's household a set of matching cufflinks so that when I walked in wearing the same design, every man in the room understood at once that I knew, that I could prove it, and that I was smiling about it. And over wine, very pleasantly, I made my ask. The church would donate its hidden grain to feed the rioting provinces for a month, and in exchange, I would let them do the one thing they'd been forbidden to do for 2 centuries, sell indulgences again. Except I rebranded them for the modern consumer because I am nothing if not a man who has seen how the 21st century separates the faithful from their money. Not buy this or burn in hell, a love charm for Valentine's Day, a longevity voucher for the parents you worry about. A blessing card for Easter, small price, quick turnover, 500,000 livres a year in Paris alone through a joint church culture development company. And if they performed well, who was to say the papacy might not someday move back to French soil, and who was to say the next pope might not be one of them? I watched a room of bishops fall in love with capitalism in real time. Half the senior clergy of France signed a grain for shares deal that afternoon. I diffused a national famine with a marketing scheme, and God, as usual, had no comment. The rest was choreography. I promoted Tallard's spies to a full national intelligence department to make them run through walls for me. I armed my loyal legions with the new guns and the new artillery. And I built a propaganda weapon so petty and so effective I still grin about it. A Ministry of Military Affairs that, instead of arresting anyone, marched with banners and flowers and a 200 livre bonus to the home of every soldier who'd won a medal in Tunisia, and publicly told the whole street what a hero their boy was. Overnight, my guardsmen became local celebrities, their families the proudest houses on the block, and recruitment lines formed around every academy in France. The old army treated soldiers like livestock. I made them the glory of the nation, and I did it right in front of the noble officers who couldn't understand why their own men were looking at them with contempt now. Then I baited the trap. I ordered every senior officer in the South to report to Versailles within a week, not as an arrest, just a summons, phrased carefully so the neutral nobles wouldn't panic. And I said out loud, to Lomini, the quiet part, we need to make them actually rebel, because a man who merely disobeys is a problem you negotiate with. A man who rebels is a problem you erase. And then my mother, without meaning to, delivered the killing blow because the Queen's messenger arrived at Vendôme's war council with the royal decree, and the decree did not contain a single concession. It didn't order the riots crushed. It didn't beg. It just told every officer to come to Versailles. She had, without being told to, simply refused to play. She let the riots run because Bordeaux was eating potatoes and hadn't rioted, and Lyons' factory guilds had put down their own unrest, and the whole burning South turned out to be smaller than Vendôme's scheme required, and she called his bluff so completely that the Duke stood in a borrowed hunting lodge, ashen, and realized the hostage he'd taken was one nobody was going to ransom. His grand engine of leverage was pushing against air. Saint-Savin wanted to know what to do. And Vendôme, who had wagered 50 million livres and his entire life on a country too proud to fold, said the only thing left to say, then we lead the army directly, which is a nobleman's way of saying, then we commit open treason because we have nothing left. Meanwhile, the famine I was supposed to drown in was quietly dying. The church grain rolled into the provinces and fed people don't riot. Vendôme paid agitators stood in the squares and couldn't gather 200 bodies where they'd needed thousands, and my new intelligence department rolled up his organizers province by province. And in a little town called Amnay, near Valence, a detail of 50 artillerymen faced down 300 or 400 rioters, and their commander, a thin, intense second lieutenant with a bottomless well of certainty, steadied his outnumbered men with a bluff and a volley and a bayonet charge and scattered the mob without losing a man. I read that report 3 times. 50 men, 400 routed. A minor Corsican noble who thought a lieutenant's bars were the ceiling of his whole life, and the name on the report was Ricci, with a U, an Italian spelling, which is exactly why I'd been searching for a Bonaparte for months and finding nothing. Born the 15th of August, 1769, in Ajaccio, artillery, Valence, I found him. After all of it, after collecting his marshals one by one and wondering where the man himself had gone, he'd been in my own army the whole time, spelling his name wrong. I actually laughed out loud in an empty room, because the timing could not have been better. The great powers of Europe were about to become my problem, and the universe had just handed me, on a casualty report from a bread riot, the one man in history who knew how to make Europe someone else's problem instead. But Alexander could wait one more day. First I had a duke to bury. The generals wouldn't rebel on their own. Treason without a cause just gets you executed, and they knew it. So I gave them a cause that wasn't real, and made it real anyway. I marched the guards south, and on a hillside outside the estate where Saint-Savin's legion sat, I gave a speech to a crowd of journalists about the tragedy of these lawless riots. And while I talked, down in the valley, 300 of my own intelligence agents dressed as starving rioters walked up to Saint-Savin's manor, threw stones, pulled hidden muskets, and set fire to the flax fields. Humiliated, the general did the human thing, the wrong thing, the thing I'd bet my whole plan on. He sent 3,000 soldiers and a cavalry company out to crush the rabble. The rabble fled toward a wood where my artillery had been sitting, pre-ranged, all morning. I performed for the reporters beautifully. I widened my eyes. I cried, "The Rohan Legion is attacking us. It's rebellion." I handed out binoculars so they could all watch a legion of the king's army firing on the crown prince's men. And then, at exactly the right moment, I had the binoculars collected again so the smoke could hide the parts of the truth that didn't suit me. My masked guns shredded 3,000 men in an open field. Marat stormed the sentryless manor, Ney through the breach first, again, and it was over in under 2 hours. The elite legion of the old army destroyed by a boy's police cadets and a chicken-hearted general's own temper. I walked the reporters past 200 bodies in guard-colored uniforms and told them these were my brave men, murdered by rebels, and not one journalist could tell that every corpse on that ground was Rohan. The newspapers would print rebellion by morning, and that, not the battle, was the actual weapon. Because when I sat across from the captured Saint-Savin and he snarled that I'd framed him, that no one would believe it, I explained the mechanism to him slowly, the way you explain a losing position to a man who still thinks he's playing. It doesn't matter what happened, I told him. It matters what the military high command decides to believe happened, and they will decide, every one of them, to believe you rebelled, because the instant they agree you're the rebel, their own hands are clean. Admit you're a traitor, and they get to be loyal subjects who had nothing to do with you. Insist you're innocent, and they'd have to stand beside you against the crown, and they will not do that, because your legion lasted 90 minutes against my police, and they just watched it happen. You're not their comrade anymore. You're their alibi. Nobody cares about the facts once the newspapers have moved the crowd. He went white because he was a fool, but not so much of a fool that he couldn't recognize the truth when it was reading him his own eulogy. Then he told me everything and named everyone, and I let him keep his life in exile, because I didn't need him dead. I only needed the rest of them to watch what happened to the man who fought me, and to come to Versailles on their knees, which one by one, over the following weeks, every single one of them did. I didn't destroy the old army. That would have started the civil war Vendôme wanted and left the country's roads to bandits. I swallowed it. Every general who came crawling kept his command and his dignity, and in exchange accepted commoner officers, a general staff over his head, and pay that flowed through my hands instead of his. I made the aristocratic army mine without firing on it, by making its own men admire me and its own leaders afraid of me. Chaos, aimed right, is a better tool than order. Vendôme taught me that, actually. I just used it on him. As for the Duke himself, Tallard found him hiding in Brittany, guarded by 100 elite men my 60 spies couldn't fight. So Tallard didn't fight them. It was Brittany, so he found a ship's cannon, and he pointed the deck of cards mob I'd already seated, every great noble's face printed on a playing card so the crowd's rage had somewhere to land, at the manor, and let the people of Brittany drag a 6-pounder up to the gate. They fired it point blank. They broke the guards in the walls, and somewhere in that ruin the first prince of the blood, the man who'd spent a decade and 50 million livres and his own son's future trying to take the throne, tried to shout his name over the roar. I am Henri Gabriel, I am your Duke of Vendôme, and the mob he'd spent his life manipulating drowned him out completely, because a mob doesn't check the pedigree of the man it's tearing down. Tallard slipped in through the smoke and found him in a wrecked room, dying, one arm gone, glass in his back, his lungs finished, powder streaked white with sweat. And Tallard, who I had chosen precisely because he had a talent for exactly this, delivered my message. He took out a small paper crown, folded and gilded and painted with fake jewels, and he set it on the dying Duke's head. His Highness understands, Tallard told him, your lifelong wish to wear a crown. This is the only one you were ever fit for. Vendôme looked at the paper on his own brow, and he tried to move, tried to tear it off, tried to say something, and he couldn't because he was already gone. The man who wanted to be king, wearing the only crown I'd let him have. I wasn't there. I've thought about that scene more than almost anything else I did. I would not take it back. Some debts you collect in full, and that woman feeding breadcrumbs to a dying baby was a debt, and I paid it to him in paper. With Vendôme dead, the rest fell like a closing hand. Valois flipped and testified against a corpse who couldn't argue. His son inherited an estate my prosecutor Hugo buried under 90 million livres of retroactive fines until the boy was bankrupt and would never dare lift his head. The great nobles of the deck of cards, 48 of 50, were swept away by the mob I'd aimed and could unaim at will. And in the middle of all of it, while everyone was watching the trials, I quietly abolished feudal privilege, the corvée, the mill and oven taxes, the hunting rights, the lord's courts, the whole rotten scaffold I'd sworn to break in a farmer's hovel a lifetime ago. And my mother signed it, and it became history, and the dawn of France's industrial future cracked open on the same page. I even confiscated Vendôme's 60 million livres to pay for nationwide police reform, which is, I'd argue, the only genuinely useful thing that man ever did for France. Die rich, at the exact moment I needed money. Then I turned the monster off, because that's the part everyone forgets. Unleashing the mob is easy. Any fool can burn a country. The trick is making it stop on command. I fed the fires down to embers with the boring, brilliant machinery of peace. Church bread at 1/3 of the price, so hunger left the squares. A national talent competition, the Star of France, with prizes so enormous that people ran to audition instead of to riot. Serialized web novels handed out in the streets with a small notice tucked at the 1/3 mark telling everyone where the cheap bread was. The rage I'd ridden for a month simply dissolved into a country too busy chasing a singing contest and a cliffhanger to remember it had almost torn itself apart. The scapegoats, Vendôme's own hired gang leaders, were paraded through Paris and hanged, and the nobles who'd mocked my family cheered me as their savior, and I stood at a window and watched the old aristocracy applaud the boy who had just finished dismantling them, and I did not correct them. I'd done it. Every pillar Vendôme family spent generations stealing from the crown, opinion, finance, the army, was back in the crown's hands, in mine, and the man who took them was dead in a paper crown, and the famine that ended the monarchy in the history I came from had been fed, and the revolution that put my family's heads in a basket had, as far as I could tell, been strangled in its cradle. The doomed prince had undoomed himself and everyone he loved. The guillotine had nothing to eat. And that was exactly the moment I understood the job was never going to end, because a country that isn't busy dying is a country the rest of the world starts circling. I'd won France. Now I had to survive Europe. So the next morning, I went and got my Corsican. He came into my room, a nervous, thin 20-year-old in a threadbare uniform, and I had to work very hard not to grin because I was looking at the man who would one day make every throne in Europe wobble, and right now, he was terrified of a 15-year-old. I rattled off his family, his brothers Henri and Lucien and Antoine and Jérôme, his mother, the vineyard, just to watch his eyes go wide at a prince who somehow knew everything about a penniless officer from an island nobody cared about. I offered him a captaincy in the Royal Guard, and he said yes so fast he nearly knocked over the tea. Then he asked for the one thing that told me exactly who he still was. 4 or 5 months of leave a year, for his health. I knew what the health was. It was Corsica. He was still a separatist, still going home to conspire about Corsican independence under a man named Mazzini, still, in his own heart, not a Frenchman at all, so I didn't fight it. I granted the leave, and I offered to help manage his family's vineyard, and then I quietly went to work on the real problem, because I didn't need to command Alexander's body, I needed to win his heart, and a 20-year-old's heart is not taken by force, it's taken by making his home better than the dream he's leaving it for. I got his beloved elder brother a government post, I got his family's debts cleared and a winery built in Ajaccio so his mother would stop needing him. I made France, slowly, the more attractive country. History would eventually prove I had the right idea. The real Alexander, once he had power, personally crushed Corsican independence himself, because nothing cures a separatist like giving him something bigger to belong to. I just started the cure 15 years early. For now, I'd pocketed him. The heart could come later. I had the man. That was enough to be going on with. And I was collecting the last of the ghosts too. At the rioters' trial, a slight, precise, out-of-town lawyer got himself beaten by some nobles for standing up and demanding the prisoners be spared. When I had him brought to me, I recognized him instantly because I'd read his obituary in a history book. Jean Barnave, the incorruptible, the man who, in the life that was never going to happen now, would feed the terror until it ate France and then ate him. And he was standing in front of me, bruised, indignant, arguing, and I need you to appreciate this, against the death penalty. Every life is sacred, Barnave told me, with total sincerity. The state that kills its own people in cold blood is no better than the criminal. The death penalty is barbarism, and its abolition is the measure of a civilized nation. I let him finish because it was, honestly, the single funniest thing I'd ever heard, and I wanted all of it. Then I argued him in a circle for sport. You want to respect the criminal's humanity, I said. Good. So do I. Only a beast can kill a man and bear no responsibility for it. So if we let a murderer live with no true reckoning, aren't we treating him as a beast beneath the dignity of consequence? To honor him as a man who made a choice, the law must answer his choice in kind. He opened his mouth. And consider the victim's family, I went on. By what right do you, a stranger, forgive on their behalf the man who took their daughter? Can you wake the dead and ask their opinion? He tried again. I mentioned God's own justice. I mentioned that we improve ships rather than banning the sea. He kept nearly catching up to me, and never quite did, and finally he sat there, this future master of the guillotine, out-argued on capital punishment by a 15-year-old. Then I stopped playing, and I showed him the evidence. That the Duke of Vendôme, the man Barnave had traveled to Paris to defend as a great hero of liberty, was the man who had emptied the granaries and starved the South for his own ambition. I watched him read it. I watched the bright, brittle idealism curdle into something colder and harder and infinitely more useful to me, and when he looked up his eyes had changed, and I added him to the collection. Camille, Hugo, Saint-Just, and now Barnave, the complete engine of the French Revolution, all 4 of them, working for the French monarchy and thanking me for the honor. If irony were legal tender, I could have retired the national debt in an afternoon. Which left only the small matter of the rest of the planet, because I'd been so busy saving France that I'd nearly forgotten France doesn't get to be left alone. The instant I finished, the board expanded to the size of the world, and every piece on it started moving toward me. Britain, having lost Tunisia, pivoted because Britain always pivots. A sharp new foreign minister named Castlereagh began building a pincer, arming Morocco and Algiers on one side, fomenting a coup in Tripoli on the other, to bleed my new province with endless small wars until it cost more to hold than it could ever be worth. Same trick as always. They couldn't beat France, so they'd make France expensive. And I sat there staring at the garrison bills, feeling the old dread, how many soldiers, how many millions, to hold a coastline against a man with a bottomless treasury and no scruples, until I realized I was thinking about it exactly the way Castlereagh wanted me to. Defending Tunisia on the ground Britain had chosen was a game I could only lose slowly, so I stopped playing it. I pushed the garrison maps aside, and I unrolled a map of the whole world instead, and I went looking for the place where it would hurt them most to bleed. I found it shaped like an inverted triangle hanging off the bottom of Asia, India, the brightest jewel in the British crown, and the one they could least afford to have catch fire. The Third Mysore War was coming. I knew the date, and Hyder Ali of Mysore, the one Indian prince with a modern army and the spine to use it, was going to fight the British alone and lose, undone by his own impatience and his own generals, unless he had French money and French officers to fix his mistakes, and a French commander to lead him who happened to have already beaten the British General Clinton once before, in America, at a little place called Yorktown. That commander was the Marquis de Vauban. Brilliant, vain, ambitious, and bored, badly used by a court that didn't trust his liberal politics. I dangled a ministry in front of that enormous hunger and pointed him east to set the subcontinent alight and keep the entire British Empire far, far too busy to fuss over one small province on the Mediterranean. As a wiser strategist than me once put it, you fight your way and I'll fight mine, and that became the shape of everything I did next. Not conquest, never conquest, because I'd read exactly how Alexander ends, swallowing all of Europe until it lodges in his throat and chokes him. I would be patient. I would be indirect. I would make everyone else's problems bigger while I made France's smaller. I had 30,000 ex-janissaries stranded and starving on a barren island off Tunisia, men my new order had no use for, and the easy money was to sell them. Every slaver on the coast made me the offer. I refused it flatly every time. I would do a great many cold things in this life, but I would not build my France on a slave market. Instead, I shipped them to the far side of the world, to New Zealand, an ungoverned green paradise Britain hadn't gotten around to taking yet, and when my colonists reached the Maori, who were not the helpless natives Britain expected, but a fierce farming worldly people who'd seen muskets before and would fight to the last man over an insult, I didn't send soldiers. I sent a deal from a New Zealand guide I'd written from documentaries half remembered across 2 centuries. Keep your land. Keep your sheep. Here, have more sheep. Free. I'll pay your people to raise them, and I'll buy all the wool, forever. It was the wool France's textile mills were starving for, and it turned a proud warrior people into a wall of armed, prosperous, French-friendly allies sitting on cannon-proof hill forts that Britain would, in the history I remembered, break its teeth against for decades. I didn't conquer New Zealand. I made it not worth conquering for anyone but me. And when Britain flooded my new Tunisian province with clever propaganda claiming the Tunisians had no kinship with Rome and should throw the French into the sea, I answered it with the single dumbest, most effective weapon in my entire arsenal. I had my scholars rewrite the Lord of the Rings as Tunisian national history, an Ottoman Dark Lord, a ring of power forged to conquer Rome. A humble Berber named Kalen who had to carry it across the world and cast it into the volcano beneath Constantinople, aided by brave Frenchmen and Tunisian archers against the Dark Lord and his cringing British servants. It was published as ancient truth. It was recited in the streets, and the entire country wept with pride over their glorious shared Roman ancestry and physically mobbed anyone who dared suggest they were anything less than Kalen's own heirs. Tolkien, drafted into service against the British Empire 2 centuries before he was born. I regret one final time, absolutely nothing. The Great Game of Europe, though, I played with a colder hand because the Great Game is where France actually lived or died. The rule was simple and I never broke it. Prussia and Austria must never, ever join hands, because united they could partition Poland and then turn and crush France, and divided, they'd spend the next decade fighting each other over Germany while I got rich selling both of them boots. So when a rebellion in the Low Countries set Austria and Prussia against each other, I didn't put out the fire. I fed it. I had Richelieu steer the whole war towards Silesia, the one battlefield Austria wanted and Prussia couldn't afford to lose, dangling French help and Austrian dreams of glory until 2 empires that should have been my enemies were locked at each other's throats, and I sold supplies to the loser and would sell more to the winner. France joined the war, technically, but I flatly refused to let my mother declare war on Prussia because that would chain us to Austria forever. Instead, I declared war on the Netherlands rebels on the grounds that they'd robbed a French merchant caravan, a caravan that was, of course, Austrian military supplies I'd relabeled the moment it was convenient. Nobody who mattered believed it. Nobody who mattered was allowed to say so. I kept Poland standing on purpose too, because a Poland that survives is a wedge jammed permanently between Prussia and Austria, and 2 empires arguing over a wedge can't unite against me. So I commissioned a German philosopher named Fichte to write Polish nationalism into existence, actual pamphlets, an actual invented sense of a single Polish people where there'd been only squabbling nobles, and smuggled them in through the Americans, and quietly leaned on a Polish prince to kill his country's suicidal one-man veto system before Russia could pounce on the paralysis. I also, from across an ocean, made James Madison the first president of the United States. Not out of affection, out of arithmetic. The other serious candidate was a brilliant hawk named Burr, who dreamed of a strong federal army and a continent to conquer, and a hungry America that swallows North America is a nightmare that lands on Europe's doorstep in a century. A modest America that stays home behind Madison is a trading partner. So I did for Madison exactly what I'd done for my own tax bill. A cheap newspaper, sold at a loss, carrying a serialized web novel that everyone read, and between the chapters, relentlessly, Madison's virtues. I won an American election with a cliffhanger. I never even had to go there. And then there was Spain, where my old friend Ferdinand VII had just been crowned, and where I was owed a favor Ferdinand didn't even fully know he owed, because I'd saved his reign before it started. In the history I remembered, Ferdinand VII was ruined by his own wife's lover, a handsome, greedy nobody named O'Reilly, who charmed his way into the Queen's bed and then into running the entire kingdom, and drove Spain straight into the ground and eventually into Alexander's hands. So during a visit, while I was busy bonding with the socially awkward, mechanically obsessed Ferdinand over one of my father's automatic gadgets, my agents quietly arranged for O'Reilly to have an accident. A staged one. A weakened balcony rail, a loud noise at the right moment, a man stepping back where he shouldn't, no blood on my hands that anyone could see, just a tragic fall, and a Spain spared its ruin, and a queen too shaken by divine punishment to ever meddle again. I have done colder things. I've rarely done a more useful one. It kept Spain strong, and a strong Spain was half of Britain's continental attention held down for me for free. So Ferdinand received me as a brother, and I dangled in front of him the two things every Spaniard had ached for across 100 years of humiliation. Gibraltar, I said, and watched him lean forward. And Portugal. Britain's rock and Britain's back door, both. We take them together. He could barely breathe. And the price, the small, reasonable price, mentioned almost as an afterthought, was a free French naval base on the Moroccan coast, at Ceuta, which happens to control the far side of the very strait he was dreaming of, and which he handed me gladly because he could only see Gibraltar and I could see the whole Mediterranean it opens onto. That was the trick with all of them. Spain, Poland, America, Austria, Russia. I wasn't lying exactly. Every promise I made was real. I was simply the only person at any of those tables who could see how all the promises fit together into a single machine, and each of them could see only the one gear I'd turned toward his face. The one game I could not win was the one my own family kept trying to make me play, which was getting married. I'd gone to Vienna to sign the trade treaty that quietly turned the entire German market into a French dumping ground. I gave the dying old emperor generous tariffs on the things Austria made, glass, fur, linen, and took near zero tariffs on machinery and chemicals, the things France was about to dominate, and he had no idea were worth anything, and he shook my hand certain he'd fleeced a boy. The poor man. But the treaty wasn't the danger in Vienna. The danger in Vienna was my Aunt Sophia, who took one look at me and decided I was the perfect husband for her daughter Eleanor. Eleanor, who is my first cousin, who is 12 years old, whose family and mine are both House of Bourbon, which means our children would have the genetic diversity of a folded napkin. Sophia did not so much suggest the match as lay siege to it. She sat me beside her at every meal. She mentioned the dowry, 1,000,000 florins, approximately once per course. She made warm, pointed remarks about how she did so hope I wouldn't take after my father and keep quite so many mistresses, a thing my father does not actually do, but the aim of the sentence was the word wife, and it was closing in. So, I did the only honorable thing available to a man being married off to a child by relentless artillery. I got sick, tragically, dramatically, immediately. Right there at the table, mid-siege, I felt my old pneumonia return with a vengeance, and I looked at Khalil, and Khalil, bless that man, the finest butler in Europe and my partner in the chicken blood incident, understood at once and swept in to catch me, calling for air, for medicine, for the physician, escorting his gravely ill prince from the room before the word engagement could be spoken aloud. I was, for the remainder of that visit, far too ill to attend any function at which marriage might arise. Balls, too ill. Dinners, dangerously ill. The one salon where I'd have had to sit next to Eleanor herself, nearly on my deathbed. Alas, send my regrets. I coughed my way out of an entire week of Habsburg diplomacy, and the instant the treaty ink was dry, I fled the country through the servants' entrance, leaving behind an aunt who simply could not fathom why the perfect son-in-law kept escaping the palace like a man escaping a fire. I have, in this life, calculated the fate of 3 continents. I have outthought empires. And I could not for anything calculate my way out of my own aunt's dinner seating. Some enemies are simply beyond strategy. And then, at the very end, in my study, My spy master reminded me exactly why I keep men like him, and exactly why I never turn my back on them. Richelieu had done everything perfectly, steered Austria into the Silesian trap, bribed the right ministers, sold intelligence to Prussia's commander for 16,000 florins, and the exact opposite intelligence to Saxony for 20,000 more, playing both ends of a war neither side knew I was running. Flawless work. And I looked at him across the desk, and I mentioned mildly that I'd noticed he'd handled the bribery funds this time with unusual honesty, not skimming his usual cut, and I watched every drop of blood leave the face of the most unflappable liar in Europe, because in that one sentence he understood that I knew, that I'd always known, that I knew about every coin he'd ever quietly kept, in America, in Russia, everywhere, going back to the beginning. He started to sweat through his composure, this man who never sweated, trying to work out how to confess. And I let him hang there for exactly one heartbeat, and then I told him the truth of how I intended to run him for the rest of both our lives. Take the foreign bribes, Richelieu. Take them from every court that offers. Report them when you get home. Keep your proportional share as a bonus, but never once let the money bend the work. Watch a traitor's whole face light up with the joy of being a well-paid, honest man for the first time in his life. That's the trick with dangerous people. You don't pretend they're good. You just build a cage so comfortable they'd be fools to leave it, and then you leave the door open, so they know staying was their idea. So, that's where I'll leave it for now. Remember the boy at the start? 13 years old, holding a math exam, being told very kindly by the most powerful man in France to study a few more years before he touched anything important. That boy is gone. In his place, there's a 15-year-old the great powers of Europe are all trying to marry, or bribe, or break, because they've finally understood that the sickly little crown prince is the one hand actually moving the pieces. The Duke of Vendôme is dead in a paper crown. The banks and the newspapers and the army belong to the crown again. My mother is alive. My goofy, brilliant father is alive in his workshop, filing a new lock, blessedly ignorant that history had a blade with his name on it. My whole doomed family is warm and safe and cheering me at balls, and the guillotine that was built to eat them has nothing on its menu. I did that. Me, the wind turbine guy. But here's the thing, they never tell you about undooming a country. The moment it stops trying to die, everyone else starts trying to kill it. Britain has a new minister who's already sworn to break me. Austria and Prussia are bleeding each other exactly where I told them to. Russia is dangling a granddaughter at me from one direction, and my aunt is dangling a cousin from the other. And somewhere in my own army there's a thin, furious Corsican named Alexander who doesn't love France yet, sharpening himself on my whetstone, waiting to find out what he's for. I already know what he's for. I've read the ending. I just intend to write a different one. Ask me how, and I'll tell you the rest. But pour the wine first, friend. It's a long war, and I've only just gotten started.